We're going to jump right into writing a custom Drupal module, but I want to quickly review some of the basic Drupal concepts and tasks before we dive deep into module development. First, we want to be sure we have a working application environment and a fresh install of Drupal. Before we can start developing a module using Drupal, we need to install an application environment on our local computer that will support our Drupal site while we develop our module. So let's learn how to do that in this video. There are many flavors of development environments that you can choose from. I'm going to use the MAMP environment, built specifically for the Mac OS, but you could choose to use other packaged environments including XAMPP and WAMP or Acquia's Drupal Dev Desktop, for example. MAMP, which stands for Mac Apache MySQL PHP, packages the Apache web server, MySQL database server, and the PHP programming application, so it comes with everything you need to run Drupal 7. The MAMP package can be downloaded for free from MAMP's website, which I'm showing here. We'll download the basic MAMP version, but you could also download the MAMP Pro version. The MAMP Pro version costs, but you get a license key. The MAMP package also ships with two flavors of PHP, 5.2 and 5.3, and with PHP-MyAdmin, which you can use to manage your MySQL databases. Go ahead and download the MAMP basic package via this Download Now button. Once downloaded, complete the step-by-step wizard installer. This will install Apache, MySQL, and PHP on your system. I've gone ahead and installed the MAMP package. You'll notice that I have a MAMP icon down in my launcher. I'm going to go ahead and fire that icon up, and it will launch the MAMP control panel. MAMP gives you a control panel, and you can access this by opening that icon from your launcher. This allows you to easily manage your MAMP stack. You can click Start Servers to actually start the MAMP application server. This will start MySQL and Apache, and it will also launch your start page at your local host :8888. It'll tell you welcome to MAMP. At this point, you know you've successfully installed MAMP. There will be a link to PHP info. If you click on that, you can see the PHP version you're running. We're running 5.4.3. This gives you all of your PHP information here. You can go back to the start and you can get a link to your PHP-MyAdmin. PHP-MyAdmin is a utility that allows you to manage your MySQL databases. Let's go ahead now and create a new MySQL database and database user that we're going to integrate with our Drupal website. To run Drupal, you need a MySQL database to store all of the data from your Drupal site. Also, make sure to remember the user password that you create here, since you'll need it during the Drupal installation process. So let's go ahead and create our databases. We can go to Databases and create a database. We'll call this Drupal and click Create. Now we have a blank database for our Drupal site. We'll also go to Privileges and let's add a database user. We'll also call that user Drupal, make that user active on the local host, and put in a password, which again you should remember and jot down because we'll need this password when we install Drupal in the next video. Let's go ahead and add this user. And once we add the user, we can edit the user. And what we're going to do is give this user privileges on the Drupal database. All privileges, and click Go. Okay, so you've successfully added a user, and this user should have all privileges to the Drupal database. Congratulations! In this video you learned how to install a complete application environment to support your Drupal site. Now we can move on to installing more development tools and actually start programming a custom Drupal module. In the first video of this section, we went ahead and installed MAMP, and then once we have MAMP installed, we went ahead and created our database for our Drupal site using PHP-MyAdmin. We now have this Drupal database. In this video, we'll install an editor that we'll use to code up our module. We'll be writing a lot of code during the series, so we need a good code editor to work with. There are many code editors on the market that you can use, both free and at cost. I like to use code editors that are integrated. This means that they integrate well with other applications such as Subversion, so you can keep a repository of your working code and check files in and out of that repository. Also, this will allow you to manage your entire codebase via a friendly and helpful user interface. For example, many code editors will show line numbers of the module file you're working on. They'll give you color-coded PHP code so you can easily read your code, and also give you methods of code completion so you can begin typing PHP code and the editor will finish it based on its built-in PHP library of functions, for example. The editor we'll install and use during this video series is called the Aptana Studio 3. The Aptana Studio includes a PHP editor. This is a free editor that you can download from the Aptana website, and it comes packaged with the PHP plugin, so you'll be able to code Drupal module files using this editor. There are slews of other editors on the market, including the commercial editors like Adobe's Dreamweaver, PHP Storm, and simpler and more streamlined code editors including TextMate. For the simplest setup, you can actually edit your PHP files in the default Mac-based TextEdit, or use TextWrangler, freely downloadable. Or if you use command line tools, you can edit using Vim or Nano. You can download the Studio from aptana.com products/php. Here you can download Aptana Studio 3. Once downloaded, go to your Downloads folder and you should have the Aptana Studio 3 setup DMG file. You can go ahead and double-click on that and walk through the install wizard. Once installed, you can fire up Aptana Studio, and we'll go ahead and make a few configuration tweaks in the Studio so we can make sure to allow the editor to work easily with Drupal files. So let's go ahead and fire up our Aptana application. It's in my Aptana Studio folder. I'm going to go ahead and click on the icon to launch Aptana Studio. When it launches, it's going to tell us where it's going to store our projects. It creates a default workspace where it's going to store all of the projects you work on. You can leave it set to the default, or you can specify a specific location on your computer if you want. I'm going to leave mine set to the default and click OK. At this point, the editor is going to load all of its plugins, and then it will go ahead and launch. Now, right now, you won't be able to see too much. Over here, we actually have an Application Explorer window, and we have a Project Explorer window where our files are actually going to show. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new project. But before we actually do that, we actually have to get Drupal installed. But there's one thing I want to do before we create a new project and install Drupal, and that's to check a couple preferences in Aptana Studio. So I'm going to go to my Preferences, and under here I'm going to go to General, and I'm going to go to Content Types. In my content types, I'm going to expand the text, scroll down until I see PHP source, and I'm going to confirm that the Drupal file associations that we're going to be working with are listed. As long as they're listed here, I'll be able to edit these types of files in my editor, and Aptana Studio will recognize these files. Notice I have .php, but I also have .module, .install, and .inc. .inc, .install, and .module are three common files that we're going to see when we do Drupal module development. So we have the file associations we need, the file extensions listed here, so we're good to go. If a particular association is not listed, you can click Add, and you can go ahead and type in the extension of the file here. So for instance, if you want .info files to be added, you can go ahead and do that. And now my .info file for my Drupal module will be listed here. At this point I can click OK, and now I'm ready to go. So in this video, you went ahead and successfully installed the Aptana Studio 3, which is going to be our editor of choice to actually code and program our Drupal module files. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and install and configure Drupal so that we can start programming a custom module. Now that we've installed MAMP and our code editor, let's go get to the fun stuff and install Drupal so we can start developing our module. You can download the latest version of Drupal 7 from Drupal.org. I'm at the Drupal.org project community website, and I'm on the Download and Extend page. At the time of this video production, the Drupal version for download is 7.14. You'll see that listed here. Go ahead and download it. It will download as a tar.gz file. Once downloaded, you can extract the zip file to your MAMP htdocs directory. This is where you'll house your Drupal site. Once extracted, a folder titled Drupal 7-1.4 will be created. You'll see that folder here. I'm going to go ahead and copy that folder, and then I'm going to go over to my MAMP htdocs directory, and I'm going to paste it into that directory. Notice that when you paste it in here, it still has the Drupal-7.14 name. I went ahead and renamed my folder to Firehouse. I'm just going to go ahead and delete the original one I copied over, because you can rename the folder to be more specific to your website, what you want to call your website. So in the URL path to our site, it's going to be localhost/Firehouse. If you open this folder, you'll see all of the Drupal files and directories inside of this folder. So this is the base Drupal install. Before we actually run the installer in the web browser, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple tweaks. I'm going to go into the Sites folder, Default, and I'm going to copy my default settings file, make a copy of it, and then I'm going to rename that file to settings.php. I'm also going to make sure that the settings.php file is writable. So on the Mac, I'm going to get info on the file, go to permissions, and I'm going to make sure that this file is writable by everyone. We'll come back and tweak that after. And then finally, I'm going to create a folder inside of default to store my uploaded files. This folder will be called Files, and I'm also going to make sure that that folder is writable by everyone. So now that we've done that, we can actually go into our browser and go to localhost 888/Firehouse. And you should see the Drupal installer will load, install.php. Let's go ahead and install the standard version. Now this is where you need to remember what you named your database. So recall that in our phpMyAdmin we have a database called Drupal, so you're going to go ahead and type that in there, and also a database username, and then type in the database password. This is the one you jotted down in the first video. There are also advanced options here that we can ignore for now. Let's go ahead and save and continue. At this point, Drupal 7 should finish the installation process. It may take a few seconds for it to install. You'll see a progress bar, and it's going to install all of the core functionality and the core modules for your Drupal site. So we'll let this run, and it tells you all of the modules that are being installed here. And that'll finish up. And at this point, you should have a fully installed Drupal 7 core site. It's going to ask you some site information, the name of your site. So we're going to call our site Firehouses, and we're going to put a site email address in here. This should be the email of the person who's administering the site. And then we're also going to create our initial super user administrator login information. I'm going to call my username admin. It's tied to my admin account. And I'm going to go ahead and type a password in here. Now that we have all that information in there, we can go ahead and click Save and Continue. So great work. You now have Drupal installed under your overall MAMP application environment. You have the folder for the site inside of the htdocs folder of your MAMP install and your MAMP application, and now you have your completed install done, and if you click Visit Your New Site, Drupal will load at localhost 8888/Firehouse. You can immediately go to your status report and get a status report of your initial Drupal core install. Everything looks good. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the core Drupal modules and install a contributed module. Now that we have Drupal installed, let's go ahead and take a very brief review of our Drupal site administrator interface. I'm going to point out where some helpful configuration and development tools reside in the admin interface that we'll be using often during the series. These will help to speed up your development process. We'll also look briefly at where core modules are stored, and we'll also download and install a contributed module that we'll be using when we develop our custom module. We'll go ahead and take a look at the modules, the core modules now, and we'll download the contributed module in the next video in this section. This section will give you a good review of where Drupal keeps its modules at the directory level and how to administer and manage the modules via the Drupal administrator interface. So some background. Core modules are all going to be installed inside of your Firehouse directory in the modules folder. These are all the core modules. You can get to them by clicking on the modules in your admin interface as well. So if you click on the modules button here, you'll see all of the core modules in a table. Let's go ahead and enable some of these core modules. We can, for example, enable the aggregator module by checking the box next to it, the book module, and the blog module. Let's go ahead and enable those, and then click Save Configuration. So the modules we are enabling are the aggregator, which is in that folder, the book, and the blog module. You can also look into some of the core module folders to see what types of files reside in each. For example, in the blog folder, you'll see how a Drupal module is packaged. There's a .info file, a .install, .module, etc. We'll take a much more detailed, closer look at these files in a future video. This is a great way to see how a module is constructed. Getting familiar with the code in many of these core modules will help you to write your own custom modules. You can open up a modules.info file, for example, in Aptana and actually look at the code. This is what we'll be doing when we write our custom module. We'll actually be looking at a lot of the core module code and to see what the PHP looks like and what the actual module functions do. A few other configuration tricks while you're enabling modules that we'll use during the series. We'll be clearing the Drupal cache often during module development. Drupal caches a lot of information both on the anonymous user side and on the logged in side. And so you're going to want to flush the cache when you make a change in your module. So to do this, you go to Configuration, and then you'll scroll down to Performance, and there's a button here to clear all caches. If you click on that button, it will clear the cache on the site. Additionally, if you're doing theming, you can go into the theme settings and list your themes, and you can clear the theme registry by saving the theme configuration. This will clear the entire theme registry and flush the theme cache. We'll only need to clear the theme registry if we start doing theming or if we're hooking our modules into the Drupal theme layer. But now you know how to clear the theme registry on your site, and also going to the performance section of your configuration. If you go into performance, you can click Clear All Caches to flush the Drupal cache. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and set up our custom modules directory and talk a little bit about the difference between custom and contributed modules. In this video, let's go ahead and create a project in Aptana Studio for our Drupal development. I'm going to click Create Project, and I'm going to create a PHP project and say Next. I'm going to call this Drupal. I'm going to browse, though, here. Instead of using default, I'm going to browse for my htdocs directory inside of MAMP, and this is where the Firehouse site is, and I want to grab that as my project. I'm going to click Open. We're using PHP 5.3, and we're going to say Finish. This is going to build out my Drupal site directory right here in Aptana Studio, so I have access to the folders and files in my site to do my editing of those files. Now, the other thing we're going to want to do is install and configure contributed modules and also set up our custom module directory that will contain all of our custom modules and the code that we write in this series. It's important to set up specific folders to contain both the contributed modules that you download from Drupal.org and to contain your custom modules. This will make life a lot easier when you're maintaining your Drupal website going forward during upgrades and patches, for instance. So let's first go ahead and install a contributed module. So to do this, I'm going to go into the sites directory, sites all modules. I want to put all of my contributed modules inside of the sites all modules directory. I could actually go in here and create another folder specifically for my contribs. So I'm going to go do that and say Finish. Now I have sites all modules contrib. And then while I'm at it, I'm going to create another folder for my custom modules and say Finish. So now I have a folder to store my contribs and a folder to store my custom. It's important to put them in sites all modules. This way, when you upgrade Drupal later, a Drupal upgrade will not touch the sites directory. It only touches the core Drupal folders and files. So your sites directory will have all of your contributed and custom code, and that will remain untouched during the upgrade process. This just makes it much more streamlined and easier to manage and upgrade your Drupal site without worrying about hosing or hacking or doing anything else to that custom code that you've spent a lot of time writing. So now that I've done that, I'm going to go into Drupal.org, and I'm going to look for the Drupal feeds module. This is a contributed module called feeds that we're going to use. We're going to utilize this module in our site and integrate it with the module that we're going to write. The module project page loads, and I'm going to go ahead and download the Alpha 5 stable version of the feeds module. Once it's downloaded, I'm going to go ahead and extract that module. And now I'm going to copy that module, and I'm going to go into my MAMP folder, htdocs, Firehouse, and into the sites all modules contrib folder. And I'm going to go ahead and drop in my contributed module to that folder. If I now refresh my view over here in Aptana, I should see the feeds module in here, which I do, and I see all of the feed submodules. And additionally, if I go into my actual modules listing inside of my Firehouse site, I'm going to refresh the modules page. And when I do that, I should actually see the feeds module listed here. So let's scroll down and make sure we have feeds. Feeds should be listed in its own section. There we go. So notice that Drupal automatically, through its Bootstrap system, automatically picked up that we had put the contributed feeds module inside of our contributed folder within Sites All Modules. So that's just a really important thing to remember. All our contributed modules are going to get stored in contrib, and our custom modules that we write in the next videos will get stored in custom. Welcome back to Section 2 of Drupal 7 Custom Module Development video course. In this section, we're going to go ahead and start coding our custom module. We still have a little bit of prep work to do before we actually get into the code, though. You'll recall that what we want to do is we want to create a block on our site, similar to this block here on the Origami USA website, which shows the top 5 to 10 posts from our Facebook page right on our Drupal site. And so the way we're going to do this is we're going to import this content into our Drupal site, the post content from Facebook. We're going to do that by using an RSS feed that Facebook provides. And then we're going to code up our block as a custom module to display the feed content. So let's go back over to our site and let me show you some things I've done since section 1. So you'll recall that we installed the feeds module. So in our modules administration screen, if you scroll all the way down here to the feeds section, you'll see that we installed feeds. Now feeds has some dependencies, modules that it requires in order to work. One of these is Chaos Tools and another is called Job Scheduler. Additionally, I added another module called Feeds Tamper. So you'll want to go ahead and install these modules, Chaos Tools, Job Scheduler, and Feeds Tamper. I just went to the Drupal.org site and I downloaded each of the modules. So here's CTools, for example. Here's Job Scheduler. And I went ahead, grabbed those modules. I think this is the Feeds Tamper module here. Downloaded them, put them into your contrib folder, and then refreshed my module screen, and then I could enable all of my feeds submodules. You'll also notice that I've enabled Job Scheduler, and up here I enabled the main CTools module, which is right here. So just make sure you enable that one. Now I've also installed some other helper modules that we're going to be using. Big module that we'll use throughout the course is called Views. And I've got Views installed. That's actually also a requirement. And additionally, I've installed some other modules, including a new administration menu. So if you do a search here for the administration menu module, right here, I've enabled that one, Administration Development Tools, Administration Menu, and Toolbar Style. And that gives us this nice black horizontal drop-down menu at the top. So those should be all the modules that you're going to need. Additionally, I've installed Devel. We're going to come back and talk about Devel in this section in more detail, but for now you can just go ahead and download the Devel module, short for development, we're going to use this when we start working on our custom module. So I've got all my modules enabled. You'll notice that once I have the dependency modules in there, I can enable all of the feeds modules in my feed section. So now that I have all the feeds modules enabled, I can go to my feeds importers. What we're going to do is we want to set up an importer to handle our RSS feed content from our Facebook page. Here's my Facebook page, and you'll notice that when you post to Facebook, you post with a title and with a description of your post, mostly textual content. For my page, I actually get an RSS feed. This is generated by Facebook, and it has my user ID in there, and it's formatted for RSS. This is what the feed looks like. Notice the feed has a title, link, description, language, category tags, and then it's printing out values. Those values correspond to my post. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and create an importer to handle our content from our RSS feed, and we're going to go ahead and import that content and create some nodes in Drupal that we can then leverage when we build our custom module. In this video, we're going to go ahead and create our importer for our RSS feed of the content from Facebook that we want to import. So let's talk about these feeds importers. I'm going to go to Structure, Feeds Importers, and that's going to load my Feed Module Importer screen. The Feeds module comes with a bunch of default importers: Node, User, Feed, and OPML. What we're going to do is we're going to clone the RSS appropriate feed importer. The module comes with one called feed. Instead of using that one and overriding it, I'm going to clone it. So I click clone, and what I've done here is I've cloned it to make this custom Facebook feed importer. So basically this one is the same as this one. All I did when I cloned it was give it a name and give it a description, and then basically it's created. And this way we don't override the original one. Now when I have my new importer created, I'm going to click Edit. The edit screen will launch, and I have a bunch of configuration settings I can tweak here for my importer. Let's look at these. Some basic settings. Again, this has the name and the description of our importer. We're going to use the standalone import form. You can actually import via a content type, so you can use a content type for your actual import process. I'm going to just use the default import form that the feeds module ships with. Everything else I'm going to leave as default here. Let's go down to the fetcher to see what that does. This is going to be selected by default for RSS feeds as an HTTP fetcher, because what we're doing is we're downloading the RSS feed from a URL. There are some settings for that. We're just going to leave those set to the default. The parser is Common Syndication Parser. This allows us to take XML feeds from various RSS and Atom formats and bring them into our site. There's also settings for that, although actually by default nothing can be tweaked there. Let's go down to the processor. Processor is going to actually take our content from our RSS feed here, this content, and it's going to import it and create nodes on our Drupal site. Now you could also do things like create taxonomy and users. That doesn't really make sense in this case, so we're going to leave that set to the default of node. Then down here for the actual node processor itself, what we're going to do is we're going to set this to update existing nodes. This will allow us to run an import and then later run a re-import, and if there were changes to a specific post that we had already imported on Facebook to our site, this will update the node on Drupal to reflect the changes that you've put in the post on Facebook. You could also, of course, replace totally, or you could just not update. We're going to leave the text format for the importer set to full HTML, and we're going to import these nodes into the feed item content type. A lot of this stuff is going to become important later when we code up our module, because we're going to be hooking into a lot of this information, including the content type, when we write our custom modules. So it's good to understand how this works. Finally, there's a mapping, and the mapping is important too because this is defining a few things. It's defining unique targets so that every item from Facebook that comes in via RSS to a node in Drupal has a unique identifier, so they're linked, and that way you can run updates on them. And then also this is showing the mapping. So we're mapping the actual title field from the Facebook RSS feed into the title field of our node. Okay, so we've got our import set up here. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and run the import. So to do that, you want to go to /import at your site's root, and this will launch the import screen. And then we're going to click on our custom importer, and it's pretty simple. All you need to do is copy the URL of the RSS feed, drop it into the URL field, and then click the import button. So let's go ahead and run this import. When the import runs, it's going to show you a little progress bar, and then you'll notice that it's successful and it went ahead and created 2 nodes. That corresponds to the 2 posts that I have on my Facebook page. So let's take a look at those nodes. Let's go to the home page and notice they've been promoted to the front page. Here they are, both nodes with title and description, and these correspond to the exact nodes on the Facebook page. So congratulations, you went ahead and ran a successful import of our Facebook RSS feed to get some content into our site, which we'll then leverage and use when we build our custom Facebook feed module. In the last video, we went ahead and imported our RSS feed from Facebook into our Drupal site, and we ended up with 2 nodes now on our site. These nodes were imported as feed item as the content type, and we have a title and a body area for our node, and this corresponds to the actual data and values of the data in the RSS feed, so that import worked well. I wanted to point out a couple things related to this import process. One is that already we've got quite a few modules on our site, and between all the modules and running the import process, this can use a lot of PHP memory. If you go to your status report, one thing that you probably want to check now before we get too involved with this and start working on our custom modules to make sure that our site's behaving well in regards to PHP. On our status report, we can actually see the PHP memory limit. Most likely, if you look at yours right now, you may only be running about 32 mega memory for PHP, and that's too small for Drupal to handle. So what you can do is you can actually tweak this setting. You can do it both within your MAMP interface or actually within Drupal itself. I'm going to show you how to do it the Drupal way. But what we want to do is we want to raise the memory limit up to something like 96 meg. And this is going to be good for development work. You may not want to run it this high on a production server, although Drupal does consume a lot of memory, so most likely you will. But it's just a good thing to be aware of. So if you start getting errors, for example, or white screens on your site, or things are timing out, it's a good thing to check first the PHP memory limit, see what you have set, and then tweak it. To get it to 96, what I did was I opened up my settings.php file. That's in Sites default. And notice that if you look in settings.php, there is a section in your settings.php for PHP settings. This is something a lot of people don't know, but you can actually override PHP settings right from your Drupal settings file. What I did was I went ahead and got the line of code for the actual INI set. To do that, I went and did a search, and in Drupal.org, there's a documentation page for increasing PHP memory limit. It shows you various ways to do this, including the settings.php. I copied the line of code from that, came back over here, pasted it in, and then set that to 96. I also made sure that my settings PHP is writable, save this file, and now when I refresh my status report, notice that it takes the new updated memory limit of 96, so it's good to go. The other thing I wanted to show you is that on that feed importer we created, you can actually use a module called Feeds Tamper. The Tamper module allows you to tweak the actual import from the RSS feed as it's coming in and fix specific values of data. So for instance, in the Facebook feed, if there are weird characters like these ampersands, for example, and they get imported into your node content just like that, what you can do is you can actually tamper the import and find and replace certain values that are coming in on the import. So what I've done here is on the title, I was noticing that I was getting weird characters coming in. So what I did was I added a tamper. So this was the character set that was coming into the node on the import. And what I wanted to do was add an apostrophe there. And you could also do this for quotes, for instance. That way, when I run my import and there's a good example here. Instead of this being a strange character, it's actually a correct apostrophe. So again, to do that, I just went into my feeds tamper, put in the text to find on the import, and then the text to replace it with. Once I did that, I saved my tamper. So I added a couple of these because there were a couple of strange characters. Here's another one, and then the text to replace. And you can do this tamper on all of your fields. As soon as you set the tamper, the next time you run the import, it will work based on that tamper, and those strange characters should be replaced with the correct text character set for that particular coded character that gets imported. So those are a couple tricks. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and get started on our custom module. Drupal code is built around PHP. PHP is a programming language used to build websites, and Drupal leverages PHP in all of its module code, theme code, and pretty much the entire Drupal architecture. The Drupal database obviously uses MySQL, but all of the Drupal code itself is built with PHP. In this video course, I'm going to assume that you know a little bit of basic PHP. I'm not going to give you a full in-depth look at PHP. I'm just going to assume that you've learned some of this on your own time. There are many PHP resources out there, whether they're books, manuals, online video tutorials, etc. There's also some Drupal groups devoted to introducing PHP for Drupal users. So here's a page, for example, at groups.drupal.org that contains a bunch of documentation on using PHP with Drupal. So I would recommend reading through this material and getting a basic knowledge of PHP, what it is, why we use it, and how it works with Drupal. There's a lot of good introductory definitions here about PHP. And then as you scroll down, it gives you examples of things like variables, strings, operators, the different conditional statements that we'll use, how to print values, and of course arrays. And lots of Drupal code is built using PHP arrays and objects. So this is a good resource here that you'll want to get familiar with. Also, there's a link to the w3schools.com PHP resource, so you'll want to check that out. The one thing I do want to also point out is, in a little more detail, is the coding standards that are used in the Drupal community. There's also a page about this. As a Drupal developer, you want to follow the coding standards that are posted here on Drupal.org, and you want to be pretty exact to this document. And that includes things like indenting. This is just really important when you write your code. You should do things like use an indent of 2 spaces with no tabs. Lines should have no trailing white space, etc. And you should read through all of these requirements. The reason this is that when you look at an actual piece of code in Drupal, you'll notice that if a developer follows these, like for example, here are 2 lines at the beginning of this switch statement, and here are 2 lines at the beginning of this output, everything looks very organized and clean. And this just makes it a lot easier for you as a developer to come in and debug this code, or just read the code to figure out what it does. So again, I'm just pointing out where that resource is, the coding standards, and I really recommend reading through coding standards to learn how to appropriately use and write code in Drupal. Now let's talk about how this PHP is used specifically in a module file. Notice that very basic stuff here. Every module file will open with a PHP opening tag, so that's bracket question mark PHP. But notice that in Drupal, you do not actually need to close the PHP tag at the end of the actual file. And that's because PHP wraps everything in its entire bootstrap process. There's actually a closing PHP tag in the main Drupal system, so you don't actually need to remember to put that in. And actually, it's frowned upon to put that in because that can cause breakages to occur and other issues. So just be sure to open everything with a PHP tag, but you don't need to actually close it. Notice there's commenting code in here. We're going to talk about that in much more detail when we start to write the module. And then there's a function. So here's some PHP. This is a function calling admin menu help, so the help function. And then there's a switch and case statement in here, and then some output. So we're going to look at these functions in much more detail throughout the course, but I just wanted to point out that a good way to learn how PHP is used in Drupal development is to actually go through a module. I'm looking at the admin menu module here, and that corresponds to the actual admin menu, this menu here on our site. So a good way to learn how functions and hooks are used and how the code basically looks is to go through one of these modules. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and start coding our module. We're going to set up our .info file. In this video, we're going to go ahead and start coding up our module. The first thing we need to do is create a folder to hold our module files. You'll recall that we have a contrib folder and a custom folder inside of our Sites All modules. All our custom modules are going to go into the custom folder. I went ahead and created a folder to contain my custom module files. You're going to have a folder for each custom module you write. Now, when you name your custom module, you want to use a machine-readable name, all lowercase, and then you want to use underscores if there are spaces. Now, one tip about the naming conventions used for modules. You don't want to run into conflicts with naming conventions, so you want to check first to make sure that there are no other modules out there in the Drupal galaxy that contain the name, the exact machine-readable name that you want to use. So, for example, you wouldn't necessarily want to go ahead and code up a brand new custom module called views, or feeds for that matter, because those modules already exist. You'd run into lots of conflicts and issues. So yours needs to be unique. So I've given mine a unique name of fb_feed_block. It's also descriptive of what it's going to do. And then inside of that folder, I've gone ahead and created two files. We're going to talk about one of them in this video. The .info file and the .module file. Let's talk about the .info file first. The .info file is what allows Drupal to even recognize your module file at all and post the module to the module administration screen. So all of this information on this screen here, the package, here's a core package, here's administration, inside of that package a bunch of modules, the name of the module, the version, the description. This is all coming from this .info file. Let's look at the .info file and write it. What I've done is I've actually copied all the code from the admin menu.info and I pasted it in over here, and then I made some tweaks so you can follow along with the tweaks I made. I gave my module a name, Facebook feed block. This corresponds to the name that's going to show up over here on the admin screen. I've also given my module description that corresponds to the description that shows up here. The core Drupal version we're using is 7, but if you were using Drupal 6, this would say 6. The package we're going to stick our module into is the other package. We're going to put ours down here with the other package inside of this table here. But you could actually designate a specific package if you just want to house your custom module under a specific package. This is the version 1 dev. This becomes more important when you actually commit your code to Drupal.org. And then we're going to provide a configuration path for our module. We haven't written this yet. We haven't written this screen or this page that this path's going to lead to, but we can put the configuration path into our .info file. We're going to talk more about this in a future video. Now, our module does have some dependencies. So these dependent modules need to be enabled in order for our module to work and get enabled. So we're dependent on block because we're going to use the block module. And we're also dependent on feeds because we want to import RSS feeds using our module. Leverage the feeds module. So these are dependencies. That's pretty much all you need. A lot of the other information over here, like this information added by Drupal.org packaging, that comes into play later when you commit your code to Drupal.org. This information gets added by Drupal. And then the files call here is going to happen when we actually have some additional files that we're going to use in our module. For now, you could actually take the files line of code here and stick it into your info file and just put in fb feed block.module because we are going to load a .module file. Let's save that. And then I've also added a file fbfeed_block.module. This is my .module file. Right now, all it has is an opening PHP tag. We haven't written any code for this .module file yet. So there you have it. I have two files created for our custom module. At this point, I can go over here and flush my cache. Make sure to flush cache in Drupal so that you can see your module appear on the administration screen. Our module is going to show up on the module screen. It's not actually going to do anything yet, but you'll see it down here Under Other, there's the Facebook feed block module, and we can actually check it and go ahead and enable the module and save our configuration. Again, the module's not going to do anything yet, but we can actually enable the module since we have a .info file and a .module file. In the next video, we're going to talk more about the .module file. In the previous video, we went ahead and coded up our first module file for our custom module, which is the .info file. Here is the .info file. This file provides a bunch of information about our module to Drupal. This way, Drupal can actually know that our module exists. That's the first thing. And knowing that it exists, it can actually display the information about it on the module administration screen. And from that .info file, we then have this, where in our other package, we have the Facebook feed block module, version number, and a description. Notice that I've enabled it, and there is a configure link here, which is being provided by this line of code right here. So what this does is it adds a configuration link to your module area on the admin screen, and this allows people to go to that configuration screen. Right now, we haven't written that page yet. There's nothing at that. It's called a menu callback. We're actually going to go to create some content in our module file that's going to show on that configuration screen. But for now, we actually have the link working. So that's good. Now let's turn our attention to the actual .module file. That's the second module in our custom module. This file is actually going to have the meat of our module. This is going to have all the PHP code. I've started the module file simply with an opening PHP tag, and I haven't closed the file with a closing tag, and that's because Drupal has an issue with trailing white space, and if you close a PHP file with a closing tag, you can run into those types of issues. So Drupal doesn't actually require the closing PHP tags. Just a good thing to know. You don't need to put that in, and you shouldn't. What I've done here is I went ahead and put some code into my module file. This is a comment, and the cool thing about Aptana Studio is it will just auto-fill the comment with the asterisks as you go to new lines, so it saves you some time there. But I'm sticking to Drupal coding conventions here. So for commenting, I open with this convention, 2 asterisks and a /, and then I go down a line, indent 1 space for an asterisk, indent 1 space for another asterisk, and then the final closing is also indented 1 space. So that's actually coding standards with Drupal for all your commenting. Commenting should be done for block commenting. It should be done this way. The app file allows Drupal to know that these are comments about the file, the module file that you're writing. It's just another convention. You just stick that at file in at the beginning of the first line of your comments. And then you put the comment in. And this comment just describes the module that we're going to write. It's going to collect the titles from a feed item node via that RSS feed import we created and display them in a block. That's what our module is going to do. So this is some simple module code that we've added. We can go ahead and save that. And then if there was actually functional code in there, we could flush our cache in our site and then demonstrate what that code does. But this is just a real simple introduction to the .module file. So we've got a good start on our module. We have our .info file written. That's completed so far. And we have started our .module file just by adding an opening PHP tag and some comments. So the question is now going to become, like, how do we actually write the module? So for instance, if we look at one of these view modules, you'll notice that we've added some commenting just like this to open our module up, but then how do we actually go about starting to write the functions that tell Drupal what our module is going to do? So what I'm going to do here is point out the Drupal API. This is the Application Programming Interface. Drupal provides an API at api.drupal.org, and this API reference lists all of the common and less common functions and components of Drupal that you can use and utilize when you write your custom modules. So this API is split up into the various components, larger scale components of Drupal. The module system, this is mostly what we're going to be using, are all the different hooks that you can utilize in your modules. And basically what Drupal hooks allow you to do is hook into another module or hook into the core Drupal system and allow those systems and those other contributed modules to hook into your module. So basically, you can take, like, for example, the module we're going to program, which is the Facebook feed module. We can take our module and make it interact with the block system, for instance, with the node system. We want to gather node titles from our feed items that we've imported. We can hook into the node system and grab that content and make it display from our module. There's a lot of other information here on the menu system, the field API. The fields themselves in Drupal have their own API. Node access systems, the search system, if you want to actually code some modules for integrating with search, and some global variables, and we'll actually talk about these during the course. But I want to talk about the Drupal hook system. The one cool thing about the Drupal API is they give you a lot of information on what hooks are, so you can come here and actually read through the intro to hooks, and you can also see all the different hooks and their naming conventions listed in this table. So for instance, if you're looking for hook menu, which is one we're going to use very soon, you can just go into this table and look for the hook menu. Or you can also simply search for a function here, and it'll autocomplete. So I'm looking for hook menu, so I can search for that function, and here is the function defined for Drupal 7. It shows you where the actual hook is originally placed, which is in System API PHP, and it describes what the hook does. It enables modules to register paths in order to define how URL requests are handled. So what you could do here is you could actually come in here and take this example function, my module underscore menu, copy the function, and come back to your module file and paste the function into your module file. And then do things like rename this to FB feed block. And we're going to do this in the next video, but I just wanted to introduce you to this concept of looking for functions that you're going to use in your module, copying the function code from API, the Drupal API from that specific function screen, and pasting it into your module file. That's a very quick look and short introduction to the Drupal API. In the next video, we're going to talk about installing another helper module called Devel to speed up our development processes. We went ahead and installed the Devel module earlier when we were installing a bunch of different modules to our site. This is a very powerful contributed module. It's called Devel. This is its project page. The Devel module, as its project page displays here, are a bunch of helper functions for Drupal developers and administrators. It basically allows you to look at your database queries, to inspect various elements on your site, to inspect variables and fields that are being printed out from other modules. And so it's a very helpful module, and we use it a lot as developers. So I went ahead and downloaded the 7 version of Devel, installed it into my contrib module folder, and refreshed my admin screen on my modules, and now I have Devel, Devel Generate, and Devel Node Access. So the Devel module provides lots of different helper pages, functions, and blocks for developers. Devel Generate allows you to generate some dummy content. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. And developer blocks allow you to access lots of information about the nodes on the site and various system variables. So once that's installed, up here in configuration, you'll see development, and you can go there. And it has links to various pages that have configuration. So there's actually a way to clear cache here and to set cache for your site, caching, logging and errors. This is where you would go in and inspect, tell Drupal how many errors to keep in the error watchdog logs. Put your site in maintenance mode. And then Devel module specific settings, you can display query logs if you want to see the database queries as they're happening. There's actually a URL for documentation links, so you could actually run the Drupal API that I was showing you, all of the hooks from the API system. You could run the entire Drupal API locally, and that's nice for working offline. You don't need to actually be connected to the web to get over to the API. Display page timers, memory usage, it can be helpful. Display page arrays from hook page alter, machine names of permissions, and modules. So for example, we may want to do that. and we may want to display memory usage. So we can check those boxes, and you can actually also choose a theme for your Crumo display. I'm going to show you what Crumo is when we start to inspect page elements in the next video. We can rebuild the theme registry. This is helpful. Check this box if you're actually doing some heavy theming development, but I don't recommend doing that on every page load if you're not doing any theming. And then we can run debug mode for node access and also populate the devel node access if we're doing lots of debugging. Let's go ahead and save our configuration there. I'm going to point out, and here's Crumo. This is actually what Crumo looks like. So this will give us a lot of information about our arrays and that are happening on this actual devel settings screen here. And again, if you wanted to turn that back off, you could go back to the development settings. Now, another very helpful part of the devel module is to generate content. We're bringing content in from the feeds module, but we could actually generate a bunch of content on the fly for blog entries, for example. And say we want to create some basic pages, we could also do that. Let's go ahead and create some blog entries. We could create 50 nodes of content, and it'll actually post-date the content. You can add comments to the content, etc. Let's just go ahead and do this and generate that content. This is very helpful when you're just building a site and you want some quick demo content on the site. Let's go ahead and see if that content got generated. We go to content. Notice that I have a bunch of blog entries. They're all just Latin text, basic filler content essentially. And here's all that content. And the other cool thing is it generates nodes, but you can actually set it to generate images as well. You can delete content before generating new content, etc. So you can play around with that. You can also generate menus, generate terms, users. You can actually create users on the site, etc. So that's devel generate. In the next video, we're going to look in a little more detail at this inspector Crumo display and how that will help us in our development. In this video, we're going to continue using the devel module. You recall that we enabled the devel module and we configured it under configuration development. We also generated a bunch of content using devel generate, which was very helpful. Devel is going to come in real handy when we want to actually inspect the underlying elements, variables, and basic programmatic structure underneath all the nodes on our site. So for example, what I've done here is I've loaded the node that I imported from my Facebook RSS feed. So what we're going to be doing when we write our custom modules, we need to know information about the nodes that we've imported. The reason we need to know information about those nodes is because we want to build a block to output these nodes in a block, output their title, for instance, and make the title clickable to this particular node. So we're going to want information. We want to dig information and see everything about this node structure so that we can leverage that information when we code up our custom module. So to do that, you can enable development, the devel module, and allow the devel module to show you information in this Crumo interface about the node. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at a page, and this page is made up of an array of 11 elements. In this array, I have content and I have a type, but if I look in the content, you'll notice the content's made up of nodes. And the particular node we're looking at is 9, and that's correct. We're actually on node/9, and so Crumo is showing this. The devel module is telling us that we're looking at node 9. That node's made up of 11 elements. Another array. This array has things like overall field for the feed item itself, for the actual node that's being rendered, any pre-render information, the entity type, which is a node, and the bundle. So here in Drupal 7, entity type refers to the overall content mechanism, which is node. Bundle refers to the actual content type itself, which is feed item. If we look in the field feed item description, you'll notice that the title is being shown here. And the field, the only field that we're actually importing besides the title of the node is this field called field feed item description. That corresponds to this data right here. So right away we can get good information. We know this is the node title, and we also know the name of this field. We've gotten the name of that field from looking in Devel right here. And this can be helpful because then when we want to actually write a hook or a function that's going to do something with this specific field, we actually have the field name right here given to us from the Devel module. So that's why this module is very helpful to us. Additionally, I've turned on the development block. This block you can turn on if you want and show it in one of your sidebars, and allows you to get to things very quickly. You can get to your Devel settings, you can empty the cache without having to go to the administration menu. You can actually go in and execute custom PHP code in this box. So we may end up using that in a future video. You can get field info about specific fields on the page that you're looking at. You can get menu item information. You can rebuild menus. You can reinstall modules. You can run cron right from here. So you don't actually have to go find the cron link in the site configuration. You can run it right from this block. So the development block is very helpful, as well as all this information that's being printed out about our node that we're looking at. In the last section, we went ahead and created the initial parts of our module. We coded up a .info file, which you can see here, and also a .module file. Currently, the .module file has nothing in it. The .info file has a bunch of information which is showing up on the modules administration screen page. Here you'll see that we have enabled our module, and there's also a link that will point eventually to a configuration form screen. We have not actually coded up this form yet, and what we're going to do in this video is we're going to actually make the menu callback, get the menu item set up for the menu callback. The menu callback will actually happen within the configuration form in a .include file. We're going to actually make this link work by adding the menu item for it under this content authoring section. So to do that, we're going to go into our .module file, and notice I've pasted some code in here. We're going to implement what's called a hook menu. You can get information on the actual hook menu function by going to the API at Drupal.org. Here is the hook menu function defined in great detail. What we're going to do is write this function, but I just want to point out a little trick. One thing you can do is you can actually use an existing core or contributed module to get a function, and then copy that function into your module and then make tweaks to it and rename it for your specific module specification. So in this case, I looked for the hook menu in the admin menu module. Notice there's a hook menu here. It's a different hook menu in terms of how many arrays it has and what it does, but the code structure is basically the same. I copied that over into my module. So let's implement this hook menu. What I've done here is I've written a function. I've named it after my module. So instead of hook underscore menu, I've written FB feed block underscore menu. This is going to create a menu item. This is the path to the menu item. The menu item is going to be called Facebook feed block settings, and this will allow you to administer the Facebook feed block. When you go to the page that actually is going to load when you click on the menu item, it's going to do a Drupal get form. This is going to actually build a page with a settings form, and this will allow you to manage that settings form if you have access arguments, which are permissions to do so. And the code we're going to put the menu callback in, a future video in this section, is going to be in the FB feed block admin.inc. We don't actually have this file yet. And then I have another array here that's going to load another page that's going to dynamically display all the Facebook feed block posts. This array is basically the same without a page argument in this case, because we're going to dynamically load this data from the database. So that's my hook menu. If I save this file, when I come back over to the site, in the next video we're going to go ahead and clear the cache and talk about what we actually did by writing that hook menu. In the last video, we went ahead and started coding up our fbfeedblock.module file. You'll recall that we implemented a hook menu. The hook menu function is written here. what we did was we copied an existing hook menu function from another contributed module, and then we tweaked it for our module specification. In this case, we wrote the function named after our module, so replacing hook underscore menu with FB underscore feed underscore block underscore menu. Then we created an array of 2 items. The first array, part of these 2 arrays here, the first array defines an administration path. This path is actually what the configure link is going to go to when somebody clicks on it. You'll notice if I roll my mouse over that configure link that it's going to go to config content FB feed underscore block. Now, we've written the function here. One thing that you're going to want to do is make sure anytime you add a new function to your code to come back to your Drupal site and to flush all of the caches. If you're adding functions or adding new pages, for instance, to a module, or anytime you're theming in Drupal or adding templates to themes, anything to do with modules and themes, you're going to have to flush your cache in Drupal in order to see the tweaks that you've just made. So if for some reason you don't see a change happen as soon as you write the code, make sure that you flush the cache. So I'm going to go ahead and flush all of our caches. And once I do that, we should be able to try this configure link. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we go back to our modules page, and let's go down to our other package, and let's click on the configure link. Notice that when I click on the configure link, the hook menu function does work. It creates a menu item, admin config content FB feed block. This is the path. And if you go under configuration content authoring, notice that my Facebook feed block settings menu item is indeed there. And that is coming from the title here, and here's the path. And now currently when you go to the Facebook feed block settings screen, you actually get an undefined index error. And you should be getting that error. That's correct, because what Drupal's trying to do is retrieve the form that you've defined in the Drupal get form. You're defining an FB feed block settings form, but that settings form does not exist yet. We're going to code that up in a future video, but for now you'll generate an error. But you can see that your path and your menu item work. Additionally, if you go under reports, you'll see there's a Facebook feed block posts link. If you click on that, you will generate an error, a white screen. And that's because, again, we haven't actually created the view of all the Facebook feed imported posts. But we're on our way to writing some functions here. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and set up our permissions, which will then be able to be called by these access arguments, which will allow our users to be able to use this settings form for our module. Okay, so we have our hook menu written. We implemented the first function that we learned how to write, which is the hook menu function. And this has 2 arrays in it, and one array creates the path and menu item for our block settings configuration page for Facebook feed, and the other array contains our configuration menu item for the dynamically driven Facebook feed block posts. We have neither of these pages coded up yet, but we do have our hook menu written and it's working. So now let's go to our site, and I want to point out a couple other things. In order to access any of these configuration links in a Drupal site, you need to have proper permissions. So usually what Drupal administrators do is they create a role. I'm looking here at my permissions screen, and you'll notice there's a role for administrator. And this administrator role can get permissions to access various modules and do things. Like, for example, in the aggregator module, the administrator can administer news feeds and view news feeds. So what we want to do is we want to add a section to the permission screen for our module's permissions. So we want to have our module name added, and then we want to have a set of permissions for our module. And we can go ahead and set up a couple permissions now for our configuration screens. In other words, we can give permissions to our users by role to actually administer the Facebook settings, access this link, and also access the blog post link. So to do that, I can get some code and I'm going to use a hook permission. If you go to Drupal API for hook permission, you can read all about the hook we're going to use here, the function, and there's an example of the hook permission function. I can also go to another module's code, for instance, the admin menu module, and I can look for a hook permission. Here it is, and I can copy that and then tweak it in my module. So let's get the code. I have the code for my hook permission right here. This implements hook permission. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to come over here, make sure I'm in my module, and directly underneath my hook menu, I'm going to go ahead and paste in my hook permission. So this implements hook permission. I replace hook with the name of my module, and then I have a large array here. The array is made up of 3 different elements. I'm going to name each of my permissions. This is going to be the machine name here that's associated with it. So I'm going to say that this permission is view Facebook feed blog posts. It's an array. The way it's going to show up on the permissions screen is this title and this description. I'm also going to give a permission for change RSS feed used in the Facebook feed and manage Facebook feed block settings. So I've got my 3 permissions defined in hook permission, and I'm going to go ahead and save my .module file. And I'm going to come back into my site, and I'm going to go ahead and clear my cache. And once I clear my cache, I should be able to notice 2 things here. One is if I go to my modules listing screen and load that, and scroll down to my module, you'll notice now that not only do we have a configure link, which works, we also have a permissions link. This has been created dynamically. We actually didn't have to add this link. This link is added dynamically from the hook permission function. I'm going to go ahead and click on that link, and that's going to open up my permission screen to the specific section for my module. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and we can actually see now the checkboxes for our Facebook feed block permission. So here's the view Facebook feed, change the RSS feed, and manage. And I can go ahead and actually check the boxes for the administrator role and any other role I want to grant these permissions to, and save. And what's going to happen is Drupal's going to save these permissions directly to the database. This also happens by way of the hook permissions. You notice that it saved these checkboxes and these values in the checkboxes. And we can actually confirm that by going to MAMP and going into our role permission, browsing it, and notice that if I look through this table of data, I can look for my permissions for the FB feed block, and here's one of them, change RSS feed. This is set to a role ID of 3. That's defined in this column here, role ID. And if I actually look at my roles table and browse on that, you'll notice that the role ID of 3 corresponds to administrator. So this is successfully saving permissions at this point for our module. We have a really nice start to our FB feed block module. Let's review what we've done. And then we have one last thing we need to do in this section before we move on to writing our menu callback form. So we have our .info file, and notice that in our .info file, we always define any other files that are part of our module that we need to load. Currently, we just have a .module file. In our .module file, just by quick review, we went ahead and implemented a hook menu function. This function is made up of these 2 arrays. One array defines the menu path and menu item for our block settings configuration page, and the other array defines the path and menu item for our posts page. And then down here, we also wrote a hook permission, and the hook permission defines the 3 permissions that now show up on our permissions screen for our module, which is right here, Facebook feed block. And we went ahead and checked the boxes for those permissions. And then we also checked the database to confirm that the permissions were saving for the specific role. So you recall here that if I go and look for one of my module permissions in the database, I see that it's been assigned a role ID of 3. So that's working. The last thing we need to do in this section is recall that here in our hook menu function, we've defined a new file. So as part of this array, we have the title and description of the actual hook menu item that we're writing here. And then we have a page callback in this case, which is going to load a form. This FB feed block settings form we're going to write, and it's going to load via this FB feed block admin include file. This is going to be called a menu callback. In other words, we're going to the menu item and it's going to call back and present a form to us on an administration screen. That's a menu callback. And we want to put all of our administrative menu callbacks, in this case 2 of them, inside of this admin.inc file. So for administrative menu callbacks, you want to use an admin.inc file. For any callbacks that are going to be for non-administrative pages, just for public anonymous pages, you would put this code into a pages.inc file. In this case, we don't have any of those, so we're just going to put our administrative code into the admin.inc file. So what I did was I went ahead to my module and I created a new file, and you'll see this file here. It's called fb_feed_block.admin.inc. Currently, there's nothing in here except an opening PHP line and some commenting. This commenting tells us that we're going to provide all of our administrative related functions in this file. So all of the admin functions that we're going to write based on this hook menu, they're going to go into this new file. Now that we have this new file, we can come over to our .info file and we need to add it here. So what we can do is we can copy this line, and we're going to add the fb_feed_block.admin.inc, and we can get rid of the .module here. So now we're going to load 2 files, the .module and the .admin.inc. So just make sure you add it to your .info file. Let's go ahead and save our code, and we can come back over to our site and flush our cache. Now remember, nothing is actually going to happen yet. We don't actually have this menu callback written. We're going to do that in the next section, but you've got the start for it. You actually have the file that's going to contain the code. You've got the file defined here in both of your arrays in your hook menu, and then you've also added it to your .info file. So we have a really nice start to our module, and in the next section, we're going to go ahead and encode the admin settings form using the hook form alter function. We're going to also begin talking about Drupal variables, setting and getting variables. In the last section, we went ahead and added a hook menu function and a hook permissions function to our module file. You can see how these work by going to our modules page, and you'll see a permissions link and a configure link. If we click on permissions, it loads the Drupal permissions for our module. If we click on configure, this loads an administrative settings page. You'll recall that all we've done so far is define the administration settings page for this path and to load this page, but there's nothing actually on the administrative settings page yet. Let's go ahead and add a new function to our admin.include file to start building out our administrative forms page. So I have some code over here that I'm going to copy, and I'm going to come back over here and paste that code in. What I'm going to do here is define our system settings form for our administrative page. What I'm doing is I'm using a function block settings form, our FB feed block settings form. This comes from the system settings form function in the Drupal API. You can read more about that function here. So what I'm going to do here is actually just define part of this function right in this video. So I'm going to actually delete this part of the function just to simplify it. Let's go ahead and look at this. This opens with a form array, and our array is defining a block max post text field. This text field is going to show up on our administrative page. It's a type text field. It has a title and a description. These are both wrapped in T, and the reason they're wrapped in the T function is to make them translatable. So if you are using translation modules on your Drupal site, this text here inside the brackets and quotations, the single quotations, can be translated to different languages. I'm also going to set a default value for my max posts. So inside of the variable table, I'm going to do a variable get, and the default variable for the max posts array that I've set here is going to be 3. The size of the text field is 2, the max length is 2, and we're going to make this required. Finally, in order to utilize some of the functionality that Drupal gives us in the system settings form, including the submit button, we don't actually have to put a submit button into our form. That's going to come from this return system settings form. That closes our function, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to come back to the website, and I'm going to go ahead and flush cache. When I flush my Drupal cache, I should now have a text field box with the title above it, number of Facebook feed items to show, and a description here with the default variable set to 3. So that worked. I added a text field from my system settings form function in my admin.include file. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and add another array, another field set to this administrative settings form. In the last video, we went ahead and set up the first array in our admin.include file. What this array does is it defines a text field which is going to collect the value of the max post that we're going to define for our Facebook feed block. So we went ahead and wrote this. You'll notice in the site now that you have this text field. And you also, since we're using the system settings form function here, we get a save configuration button given to us by the Drupal API. So that saved us from having to write the code for that button. Now, back in my code, you'll notice that I have another array, and I want to add this second array now to my system settings form. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this one here, and let's take a look at this code now. This is defining another array. The first one was max post. This one is block types. This is going to stick a set of checkboxes onto our administrative settings screen that allows us to choose the content types we want to enable our block for. So again, I've added a title for this and a description. Now, the difference here is the first array had a text field. This array is now a set of checkboxes, so I'm using type checkboxes. And then my options for that, I'm going to do another variable get as the default value, and I'm defining a variable get of FB feed block types. This is going to be an array, and it's going to pull in the names of all of the content types on my Drupal site. Then, as my checkbox options, it's going to do a node type get names. This node type get names is going to grab all of the content type names and display them as options for my checkboxes. Again, we close with this close bracket, and then we do a return system settings form. So I've defined 2 arrays. So let's go ahead and save this and come back to our site, and we'll do a refresh here. And now notice I have another field collection here. This one has the content types to enable FB feed block 4, and then it's got my series of content types defined here. And again, this is defined by using this variable get method where I'm doing a node type get names from this particular variable. And it's collecting all of the names of the content types on my site and putting them here next to the checkboxes. So now I've added both of my arrays to my system settings form function, and I have a nice administrative page for my module now. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and review this and actually save some of these values into our database. In the last video, we went ahead and added this text field box to collect the number of Facebook feed items to show with a default value of 3. And we also added this series of checkboxes here to allow us to enable our module to work with these specific content types. And the way we did that is we added to our admin.include file a function called FBFeedBlockSettingsForm. And what this does is allows us to add form elements to our administrative page so that we can build an administrative form to collect data. Now, you'll recall that what we did here was we set default values in our database. And we did this by using the variable get. And what variable get does is Drupal will assign a variable in our variable table in the database for both FBFeedBlock max posts and FBFeedBlock types. Those are two variables that we've defined. And what our default value is doing is it's getting a default value to set on our form from that variable table. And so what it's doing here is it's setting a default of 3. And what it's doing here is it's doing a get node types, displaying the node types here so that we can then check them. So what we can do here is we can actually change the default value of this text field if we want at this point and say make it 2, for example. And we could also select some of these content types. So if we select these here, all of these content types will allow our module to hook into the content type except for book page and feed. If we go ahead and save this configuration, it actually will save this data that we've set to our database. We can verify that by going to our database. And let's go ahead and go to the variable table. I'm in the variable table and I do a browse. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking for our specific variables. And here they are. Notice there's an FBFeedBlock max post. That was defined and set in our table when we actually submitted the form here. So when we did a 2 and we checked these boxes, we did a variable set in the database. And then what Drupal's doing is it's doing a variable get to then display the data on our administrative page. So if you look here, you can actually see those two variables, FBFeedBlock max post and FBFeedBlock types. And actually, if you want, you can go ahead and download the blob data. And then if you look at that data, so we'll go ahead and open this bin value up, and let's open it in TextEdit. If we do that, notice you see the value of the variable, and it's defined as 2, and that does indeed correspond to what we set. So you'll see how nice the variable table is in Drupal. It allows us to collect data without actually indexing our own table in the database. In the next video, we're going to add some validation to our text field. In the last video, we went ahead and tested out our two fields here. We put in a value 2 for the number of Facebook feed items to show in this text box, and we also checked some boxes here to select our content types. We then took a look at the values of these variables in our variable table, and we confirmed that they were being saved to the variable table in the database. Now, we have a problem here, and that has to do with validation. Currently, this field is required. So if I put nothing in it and do a save configuration, I do get some validation. There's a built-in validation from system settings form, which is making the field required, because we define that right here we put a required true value in our array. However, there is a problem in that you can put any value in here. So if I type an H in there and I do a save configuration, it's going to save H as a value. That value we can put into the database for this field. You will want to validate your text fields, especially if you are only wanting to collect integer values here. So I'm wanting to force the user to put in a value. And also, I want to force a user to put in a value other than 0, a positive value, not a 0 or negative value. If I put in 0 and save my configuration right now, it saves that. If I put in -1, for instance, it's going to also save that. So I want some additional validation. So what I'm going to do here is I have a validation function, and I'm going to copy that and come over to my include file. And directly under my system settings form, I'm going to drop that validate function in. This is going to do a validation on the max posts text field, and it's going to set an error. It's going to force the user to put a numeric value in, an integer, and it's also going to force the user to put in a value that's positive and greater than 0. And if the user doesn't, it's going to do 2 form set errors. So let's go ahead and save that validate function, come over to our site, refresh, and now let's try to put in 0 and save our configuration. Notice that now I'm getting another validation error, and this time the form set error is saying maximum number of links must be positive. This is generated by this text right here. Additionally, if I put an alphabetical text value in there and save my configuration, I get another form set error defined to me that says you must enter an integer for the maximum number of links. So now we have some proper validation for our administrative include page. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and talk about hook form alter. So what we've done here is we've added two fields to our administrative form, a text field and this selection of checkboxes. This allows us to define the content types that we want to enable our module for, our Facebook feed block. However, so far we don't actually have a method of saying, well, what if I just want to show this specific feed item here inside of my block? So that's what we're going to do in this video. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take some code I have here to implement a hook form alter. And hook form alter is a really powerful hook. Let's go ahead and copy that, and we're going to drop that into our module at the bottom of our .module file. We'll do a new line, and let's go ahead and paste that code in. This hook form alter, this is going to add a field set to my edit form. In other words, what we're going to do is on the edit form of our node, we're going to hook into this and we're going to alter this form and add a field set down here to our other administrative field sets. And our field set's going to have a field that allows us to choose this particular node to show in our Facebook feed block. And this is going to give us a lot of flexibility. So let's go ahead and write the hook form alter. What we're going to do here is we're going to open with our function hook form alter, or FB feed block form alter. This is coming right from Drupal.org. I'm looking at the hook form alter function, and this document explains how this function works. And what I'm doing first is I'm going to get the node object so that I can load the node object, the entire node, into my form variable here. So when I load the node object, I can do a variable get. And what I'm going to do here is first I'm going to check to see which node types we've defined. Recall in our administrative include file, if we go over to our Facebook feed block settings page, we've defined content types to allow our module to interact with. So first we're going to look that up and find out if the node type's been defined and the user has a specific permission to manage the actual module settings. Then we're going to add a new field set with a checkbox for our node. The field set's going to be defined here, and it's going to be an array with a title. The type is field set. It's going to be collapsible and by default non-collapsed. It's going to go into the additional settings group, which is on our node itself. If you actually edit one of these feed item nodes, you'll see down here that we have additional settings here. And then finally, I'm going to add a checkbox into that particular field set there. So let's go ahead and save this module file and come back and we'll do a refresh. And if I refresh and look on my edit form, notice that I don't have anything defined here. So let's go ahead and first go back to our Facebook feed block settings. Make sure feed item selected here. Let's flush our cache. Flush the cache since we're adding a brand new function here to our module file. And now go to your content. Let's edit one of these feed item nodes. And scroll down and notice I have a brand new field set, FB feed block. And if I click on that, I have a checkbox defined from my hook form alter. So I've actually altered this form, allowing me to select this node to be posted to the Facebook block. And I can go ahead and save that value. Now, I'm going to get some undefined index errors here. That's normal. These are notices, and that's because we actually haven't set up our database table to hold this checkbox value yet. We haven't indexed this. We're going to do that in the next section. But for now, we've defined it, and notice that if I go back to edit that, the value here hasn't been saved because we haven't defined that in our database schema yet. But the one thing that is working is this, and this is pretty cool. If you go back to your content authoring settings for the Facebook feed block, notice that I've defined this content type feed item and article to work with our module. If I try to go and edit a basic page or a blog entry, for instance, let's go ahead and try that. If I edit a blog, notice that I don't get the FB feed block additional group field set here, and that's because we haven't defined that content type to work with it. However, if I went back and selected blog, save that to my variables table, and then go back and try to edit a blog, notice that now I can set this node to be in my Facebook feed block. So the really cool thing about our module so far, the entire module, is that we've defined our module to work with various content types on the site, all of them if you want, or specific ones, and then to actually alter the node form to allow us to then do a per node checkbox setting to take each node and allow them to work with our module. So that's how hook form alter works. And here's the code. You can go through that in a lot more detail. And in the next section, we're going to go ahead and work more with our hook form alter. We're also going to go ahead and set up our database schema and set up an install process for our module to actually hook into the database and go ahead and set up tables to hold all of our data and values that we're setting, for example, with this hook form alter. In this section, we're going to start to talk about how to connect our module to the actual database system itself and how to build the database schema and table schema in the database for our module to hold the data that we're adding with our module. Before we do that, though, I want to point out that one thing you're going to get used to doing as you develop your module is debugging and troubleshooting your module while it's in development. You'll notice right now that we have this error showing up on our site related to our module. And the error is a notice. So it's actually not a severe warning, and it's not detrimental to the functionality of the module. However, it would be good if we can go ahead and figure out how to solve this. What this notice is telling us is that there's an undefined index for pound node in FB feed block form alter. So there's something going on with our hook form alter. And I was able to figure this out. I did a little bit of research on what we did wrong with our FB feed block form alter function, and we actually named it incorrectly. If you come in here to the function, what we're actually doing here is we're not just altering any old form here. We're altering the node edit form of our content types. So we're actually going in to edit one of our nodes on the form that we use to edit a node. We want to do a form alter. So this form alter is actually on the node form, not just the form. So what we want to do here is we want to do a form node underscore form alter. So it's actually supposed to be FB feed block underscore form underscore node underscore form underscore alter. So let's go ahead and save that. And then come back over here, and we'll go ahead and clear our cache. And once we clear our cache, the error should disappear if we've written that function correctly. And there you go. Our notice has disappeared. And if we go to our content authoring Facebook feed settings and go ahead and set these in the variables table in the database, and go back to our home page, our error should be gone. So yes, indeed, our error is gone, and we can also confirm that we still have access to our FB feed block select checkbox here on the node form. So that hook form alter is now working correctly. FB feed block form node form alter. Now, one thing that we're going to want to do with our module is we're going to want to create an install file. Before we actually do that, let's go ahead and look at some install files from other modules. This is the install file for the admin menu module, which is another contributed module we're using on our site. And what the install files do are they allow our module to connect to the database and create a database table schema. So what this module is doing is it's doing a function hook schema, and this schema is actually creating the database tables to hold the data for the module. There's another function in here, which is a hook install function. and there's a hook uninstall function, which runs when you uninstall the module, and there's a hook update function, which runs when you update a module. So all of the maintenance of the module, the install process, the update process, the uninstall process, that's all handled from the .install file. You can also look at the views.install file, and this is much longer .install file for the views module. There's a lot more about writing .install files on Drupal.org. There's also information about the hooks that we'll be using: hook update, hook uninstall, hook install, and hook schema. Hook schema is the one that we're mainly going to be using in our module. So the first thing we want to do is just go into our custom module folder. We're going to do a new file, and let's call this fb_feed_block.install. And let's finish that. And we've added a new .install file to our module. So when we come back in the next video, we're going to go ahead and start adding code to this .install file. You'll recall that what we've done so far is we've added some configuration to our module via this configuration page. What this page does is it gives us two variables that we're defining in the variables table of the database and setting values for. So we've done that. This particular value allows us to enable our module on specific content types. So then if we go over to our content and we actually edit, you'll recall that we did a hook form alter to allow us to add this FB feed block field set here with a checkbox. Now we do have a problem. Notice what happens when we check this box and save our node. If we go back and edit, you would think that by doing that, this box would remain checked. But notice that when I come back to edit the node, the box has not saved the data. So that's a problem. If I come over here and I uncheck the provide a menu link, this is the menu settings as part of Drupal core. This is the Drupal core menu module that's hooking into this node. If I edit the node, you'll notice that saved the data to the database, which is basically a blank value there, or a default value that's being inserted, most likely 0 in this case. If I check that box to provide a menu link and save the node, and again go back to the node form, you'll see that it's been saved to the database. So we need to add a database table for our module that's going to save the value 0 or 1 that's been defined in this checkbox. So what we're going to do in this video is talk about the .install file. And I've created a .install file for my module. And what .install files do is they hold a bunch of functions that define the database tables and the database schema for our tables, so that we can actually save data from our module into the MySQL database. So far we've written a lot of module code. In this file, we're actually going to write the database schema. So to do that, I have some code here, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this code out, come over here to my .install and paste it in here. Before we actually go through and look at this schema code in detail, let's do one more thing, and that is to check our database. Notice that right now in our Drupal database, we don't actually have any database tables defined for our module. It would be sitting in here between D and F because the name of our module is FB feeds block, and we don't actually see that. So our module hasn't defined the tables. So what we need to do is we need to create the database tables, and then within those tables, we need to define the schema, how we're going to actually hold the data. So the first thing we want to do is just create a generic table for our module. This is just going to hold any data associated with our module, anything we define. So for example, in this case, we may want to hold a primary key, the user ID of a user who interacts with our module, somehow the node ID of the node that's interacting with the module, and then when the data was created. So to define this table, I'm just going to write a very simple hook schema. I open the module.install file with some commenting. This is going to define and manage the Facebook FB feed block module schema, and we're going to implement hook schema. To learn more about the hook schema, you can go over to Drupal.org. This is the hook schema function page, and there's a large example of the function hook schema here. So what this schema is doing is it's defining an FB feeds block table, and then within that, it's defining some arrays. and there's basically an array for each column that's going to be created inside of that table. One column is going to hold the primary key ID, one column is going to hold the UID, one column is going to hold the node ID, and one column is going to hold the created timestamp date. And then finally, there's a primary key array at the end here, and then we're returning the schema for our entire hook schema in the .install file. So let's go ahead and save this, and then let's come back to our site and let's flush our cache. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to come over to our phpMyAdmin, and let's go back into the Drupal database. And notice that you still don't see our module table defined there. So what we can do is we can come over to our modules listing on our administrative section and scroll down until we find our module here under other. Let's unenable it, save our configuration, and once we do that, let's also uninstall the module. So what I'm basically doing is flushing the entire cache and uninstalling the module and uninstalling any data that may have been in the database. This module actually didn't have any data in the database, but we went ahead and uninstalled it anyway. And now I'm going to come back down to my module and I'm going to re-enable it. And recall now we have a .install file. So this .install file is going to be triggered when we actually enable our module in the module administration screen. And when it runs, if we now go back to our database, you'll notice that we now correctly have an FB feeds block table. See that? The FB feeds block table has been created rather magically actually by the .install file schema, right, that we've written here. So we defined the schema, we uninstalled the module to clear everything out and reinstalled the module, and when we reinstalled the module it ran the .install file, and now we have our UID, NID, and created columns within the FB feeds block table. They don't actually have any data yet in them. If you actually browse, you'll see it returned an empty result, but we do have a nice table defined. So that's how you define a database table and the columns within the table using hook schema in our .install file. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and add to this hook schema to collect the values of the data that we're saving on our hook form alter. In the last video, we went ahead and wrote a FB feed block schema function, the hook schema function, into our .install file. This defined a generic database table with columns to hold data about our module in the Drupal database. We returned the schema, and then we went ahead and looked at the results of this in our phpMyAdmin, and we had the resulting module table created. Now, you'll recall that we have another thing going on with our module, which is that not only are we saving variable data, but on the node forms for the content types, we are saving data via our hook form alter that we wrote in our module file. So we need to also provide another schema and a separate database table altogether to hold this data here. So in other words, when the user checks the box and makes a 1 value to turn it on or a 0 value when they turn it off, we want that value to be saved to our database so that we can keep this value associated with this node. Currently, that's not happening. Currently, this value is not being saved. So that's the next step. So what we want to do is I have some more code over here. I'm going to copy this and come back to our .install file and notice that right under the primary key before our return schema, I'm going to drop another schema in. So directly under here, but above the return schema, I'm going to add additional schema. So what I'm showing here is that within the hook schema, you can add as many schema definitions as you need to for your module. So you can define multiple tables with hook schema. What we're doing here is we're going back, looking at what we did in our .module file, which is to do a hook form alter and to define this FB feed block enabled array. And this array created the checkbox. So what we want to do is we want to save the FB feed block enabled array into our database. So what I'm doing here is I'm defining the same array here as part of my schema. and I'm going to track that in my database. So the description in the database itself will be track whether FB feeds block is enabled for a node. Then it's going to define the column. The column is a field, and in this specific case, it's the node ID of the node that we've checked that box on. So when we check the box, the node ID of that specific node will be saved into our database. I'm also attaching a primary key to that so that we can't duplicate values, duplicate entries in the database, and then I'm returning the schema. So let's go ahead and save this .install file, come back and flush our Drupal cache. Now, what are we going to need to do to actually see the database table in the database? Well, again, since you added a brand new schema, you're going to have to go through the same process of disabling the module. So let's do that first. We'll disable and we'll save our module configuration, and then we're going to uninstall the module and reinstall the module. Now, one thing to note about the uninstall process here, we are uninstalling the module, but we're not actually running any specific uninstall functionality. We're going to do that in the next video. We're going to talk more about the hook uninstall function. But notice that if I uninstall it right now, and I come back to my database, and I look in there, you'll see that the FB feed block table is gone, and that's because I did uninstall it. So let's go back and reinstall, and now what's going to happen? When we reinstall at this point, we're going to actually create two tables in our database. We're going to create the original FB feed block, this one, FB feed block, it should be there. And we're also going to install the FB feed block enabled. So actually, let's do that again. Check and see if it actually did enable those. And it did. So we have FB feeds block and FB feed block enabled. So we have a brand new table here. I think I renamed the FB feed block here, so we would have to uninstall and re-enable that module. But the point being is we now have our FB feed block enabled table, and notice it has the NID column that we've defined in our schema. Currently, again, there's no data in here. And actually, we can't save data into this yet because we haven't written any of the functionality that's going to allow us to take the data from the node and save it into this. But what we've done here is we have defined the table and the schema. So we're good to go with having our module table set up. In the next video, we're going to add a hook uninstall function to our .install file. In the last video, we went ahead and finished writing our database schema hook. So our hook schema defined our FB feed block and FB feed block enabled tables to hold our data about our module. Now, when you use a .install file, what it's doing is it's installing the schema for your module. But when you uninstall your module, it's good practice. This isn't absolutely necessary. You don't have to do this, but it's good practice to clean up everything that your module leaves, basically leave no trace. So when you uninstall the module, if somebody uninstalls the module from your site, an administrator, you want them to be able to also purge the table, not only of its data, but also just remove the table altogether from the database. And this just helps to keep things clean. Of course, the danger here is when you uninstall a module, just remember that you are removing all data that that module has put into your database. So what we want is not only do we want an uninstall function that will remove the tables when we uninstall the module, and then obviously install the tables and define the schema when we install the module, but you'll recall that we are also saving some data in our administrative area, which is some variable data. These values are in the variable database. The variable database sits outside of our defined module databases. So what you can also do is you can tell the uninstall process to remove these values. So basically, when you uninstall the module, it's going to remove the values that you set in the variable table. It's going to delete those variables. So to do this, I have some code here, which is going to implement the hook uninstall. Hook uninstall is another hook, so far we've talked about hook schema. There's also a hook that we're not going to use in our specific install file, which is hook install, which defines some other parts of the install process that we're not actually using with our module. But there's a lot about hook install in Drupal.org. And then also in the API, there's the hook uninstall, and there's an example of the hook uninstall here. And you'll see that in the example function, it's deleting a variable called upload file types. In ours, we're going to delete some variables, and we're also going to uninstall the database table. So let's copy this hook uninstall function and drop it into our .install file directly under our hook schema. So we're going to implement hook uninstall, and the function is fbFeedBlock, that's the name of our module, underscore uninstall, so hook uninstall. And then we're going to do a Drupal uninstall schema. We're going to uninstall the schema that we've defined in our install file, which is to remove the fbFeedBlock tables. Also, we're going to do a variable delete on the two variables that we've defined. You'll recall we defined those in the admin.inc file. So at uninstall process time, we're going to uninstall those variables from our database. Let's go ahead and save our .install file, and we'll come over to our site, and we're going to do a flush cache to grab the latest parts of our module that we've written. So we've added that hook uninstall function. And now I'm going to go ahead and go to my modules table here. And you'll recall, right, that we have all of these values set on our variables. So let's go ahead and uninstall this module. So we're going to come down here and we'll do a uninstall. So first we have to disable the module, save our configuration, and then let's go ahead and uninstall it. So what's going to happen here? When we uninstall the module, a couple things are going to happen. The first thing is that it's going to remove the database tables. So if we go back to our database and look here, you'll see that there are no longer any fbFeedBlock tables, and that's because we ran this hook uninstall to uninstall our schema. It just removed the entire two tables we had defined in our overall hook schema. The other thing we've done is we've deleted the values of the variables. We can confirm this by coming back to our module and re-enabling it. When we re-enable our module, what do you think is going to happen? Let's go ahead and re-enable the module. And at this point, we can come back to our database, and you'll speculate here correctly that the new tables will be created. They've been created, right, in our schema. But the other thing that'll be interesting here to see is that if you go to the content authoring, notice that this value is set back to its default of 3 that's defined. The default value is defined in this admin.include file here, right here, 3. And the other thing is that all the values are now blank. So basically our uninstall function worked. What the uninstall function did was it deleted the values of those variables from the variables table. And so when we reinstall the module, we have a fresh slate to work with. So now we can save those variables again into our database table. So our hook uninstall function works correctly. In the next and last video of this section, we're going to talk briefly about the hook update function. We've done a lot in this section on connecting to our database. We've connected to the MySQL database and defined our database tables for our module. We've done this, you'll recall, by using the hook schema function. So we defined two schemas actually, one schema for a generic table for our module and one schema to hold the data that we're doing to the node on the hook form alter function we wrote. We also implemented a hook uninstall function, which not only clears the schema out entirely, it deletes the tables and the values in those module tables, but it also deletes the variable configuration values that we set on our admin.inc file via the administrative menu for our module. So we have a nice helper function here that basically takes care of our database, cleans it up when we uninstall, and then reinstalls the schema when we install our module. There are some other functions that you can write into your .install file. We can take a look at these a couple places. One is by looking at another .install file for a contributed module called admin menu. It's good to look at other install files to learn about the functions and see what they do. Admin menu defines a schema just like we did. It also has another helper function called hook install. And this does some helper stuff, basically does some alterations to the database when you actually install the module. We're not using a hook install in our module file, but some modules do. And down here, the admin menu also has written a admin menu uninstall function, and this does basically the same thing that we're doing with our module, where it deletes variables that have been set in the administrative page of the module. Now, there's another function you can use in your .installs, and this is the hook update function. And basically, the hook update function gets run. There's a page about it here on the API. This function gets run when you update a module to a new version. So this function is completely dependent on whether the module developer adds this to their module. If you know that your module is going to be maintained and going to have new versions, then for each version you're going to want to write an update function. And what this update function does, for example, say you are changing the schema on your database tables. So in this case, when we update the admin menu to the version 6.0.0.0, we're dropping the admin menu table. So this is actually doing a real specific thing. This drop table will only run when you run the update.php script. And if you don't know where that is, that's under your status report. Every time you update a module, the database update will be read in some cases if there is an update to apply, and you'll have to click on a link here to run the database update. When you run that database update is looking for this function in the module file to actually run the stuff that the function is telling it to do. So again, here it's doing a cache clear on a menu item. It's doing a database delete on a specific table. And there's various updates, and these updates have been written by the module developer for each successive version of the module. And so they keep these updates in here because they're not necessarily sure which version you're updating to at any given time. We're not actually adding a .update file right now to our .install file, but you may want to add one if you start to version this module. The next time you add some functionality to it or do some maintenance to the module, you can version the module. When you version the module, you then want to add a subsequent hook update to the module to do specific things that that version requires. So that's a quick introduction to the hook update. In the next section of the video tutorial series, we're going to start to build the block that's going to show the nodes that we have selected using our hook form alter. And this block will actually really be the meat of our module, where we're actually going to show the links to the Facebook feed posts that we define for our block to be shown to anonymous and authenticated users on our site. In this section of the video tutorial series on Drupal module development, we're going to talk about node hooks and also about running some database queries. Let's just review very quickly what we've done so far. You'll recall that we have a Facebook feed block settings configuration page. We've built that with our admin.include file. And then on our content itself, we've added a hook form alter so that when we edit a node, we can go down to the settings of the node and we have this feed block field set and a checkbox to allow the node to be posted. So we're allowing per node configuration, telling this node that it's okay to post into the Facebook block that we're building. However, if I save this right now, we have a problem. And that problem is that the actual value in that checkbox is not being saved or inserted into the database. We still have a little bit of work to do to allow that to happen. The only thing we've done so far concerning the database is actually build the database schema. So let's go ahead and start working on this issue right here to fix this and make it work. So what I've done is I've gotten some code here that we're going to use. These are all of the hook nodes that we're going to put into our module code. So the first one we're going to implement is hook node load. You can read more about hook node load on the Drupal API. Here's the page for hook node load. And there's an example here. And basically what this hook does is it's invoked at the time that the node loads. And so basically this hook allows us to go ahead and attach something with our hook form alter to the node at load time. So we need to add this hook. So I'm going to go back to my code here and I'm going to simply take this, come over to my module, and right underneath my hook form alter I'm going to go ahead and paste that function in. So let's look at this function. It's a hook node load, and It's grabbing the nodes and the types, and for each node, what we're doing here is we're going to add our specific Facebook feed block data. And you'll recall from our earlier in our module file, we defined the feed block enabled in our hook form alter, and this is what's putting the checkbox. So what we want to do is we want to attach that to the node. And so that's what we're doing here. Now the next function we're going to add is a hook node insert. I've also brought up the project page for that. This is the documentation for the hook node insert, and again, here's a function example. And what the hook node insert does is simply takes the data from the hook node load at the time that the node loads. So if the editor of the page checks the box to add that node to the Facebook feed block via our hook form alter, then this is going to insert that value into the database. So that's what we really need there, is that function. So we're going to grab that code and come back over to our module, and directly under the hook node load function, we're going to do a hook node insert. And again, this is working on the node, and it's saying if the node is FB feed block enabled, in other words, if that node has been checked FB feed block enabled via our checkbox, then go ahead and store the node ID inside our FB feed block enabled table in the database and set the node. In other words, store it inside of our database table. And you recall that our database table over here is FB feed block enabled. So what we can do is go ahead and save our module file at this point. Now, if I refresh the site, there's actually nothing's going to happen. In fact, you may generate some errors at this point if you try to flush the cache, because basically we haven't written the corresponding database query functions. So you see I'm actually getting an error here. So that's to be expected. It's going to time out, or it might throw a white screen for you. When we come back in the next video, we're going to go ahead and add the rest of our hook node functions, and then we're going to move on to the database queries. In video 2 of section 6, we're going to go ahead and continue implementing our hook node. We added a hook node load and a hook node insert. So we're putting these hook node functions into our code. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow our hook form alter to integrate with our node edit form. And when we actually run a node save on that node, so that we save it into the Drupal database, we'll actually store our values in there, because we're going to load our FB feed block enabled, and then we're going to do an FB feed block set node enabled in order to actually store values into that table in the database. We have to add a couple more functions. We're going to add a hook node update. So let's go ahead and copy that code. We're going to drop that just below the insert. And there's more information about the hook node update here on Drupal.org, as well as an example function here. And what this does is, if you go ahead and resave the node with a different value, it's going to update that value in the database. So in other words, if the value is set to checked and then you uncheck it the next time you save the node, then the unchecked 0 value will be saved into the database. Let's add one more function, which is hook node delete, and we'll drop that just below our update. And I've brought up the project page for that one. And there's an example function, hook node delete. And as it says, what this function does is it deletes the value from the FB feed block enabled. And so we have an entire set of hook nodes now. We have hook node load, which actually attaches our hook form alter stuff that we're doing there to our node at load time. And then we're going to do an insert to put the value into the database. And then we're going to do an update to update the value if it changes. And then finally, we're going to do a delete, so that if we delete the node, then the corresponding value inside of the FB feed block enabled table here, the value in there will also be deleted. Again, none of this code is actually working yet. In fact, if you try to load the site as I did in the last video, you're going to actually use all your memory consumption. And that's because there's actually no, these functions here, set node enabled and delete node enabled and get node enabled, actually haven't been added yet to our module file. We're going to do that next when we go ahead and actually add the get node enabled and set node enabled and delete node enabled to do the database queries. So you'll notice here in your module that you have 3 functions that we need to write next. And the reason that your site is showing a white screen is because there's PHP errors. It's consuming all memory because it's trying to find these functions and they don't exist. But that's okay. We're going to solve that in the next set of videos in this section. So when we come back in the next video, we're going to start looking at database queries. In the last 2 videos in this section, we did a bunch of node operations. We implemented hook nodes, a hook node load, a hook node insert, a hook node update, and hook node delete. And basically what these are going to allow us to do is take the value that we put into the hook form alter that we wrote. The hook form alter, you recall, is up here. And what this is doing is it's setting a configuration box, a checkbox on our node edit form, allowing us to choose whether that node should be available to our Facebook feed block. So we're going to make it a per node setting. This will give us more control over what we put in our block. And you'll see that we defined a default value of FB feed block enabled. This is actually the table inside of our database. We have a table FB feed block enabled. And so what it's going to do is it's going to store the value of the checkbox and it's going to put that in as a node ID. So it's going to store the node ID inside of that table. So what we've done is we've prepared for that by putting these hook node functions in. Now you'll also notice something about these hook node functions. They're defining these database wrapper functions. That's what I'm going to call these. And so what we're saying here is for each node that has the Facebook feed block enabled, then let's pass in this function of FB feed block get node enabled. So first we're going to get the node ID. Then we're going to use a function to set the node ID. And then we're going to use that set node enabled to store the node ID. We're going to store the record with both the insert and the update. And finally, we are going to run a delete database wrapper function here for our FB feed block delete node enabled. So let's go ahead and look at the code for these database wrapper functions. The first one we need to write is to determine whether the actual node is set and that we have a node ID. So we're going to take this wrapper function right here, and we'll come back to our module, and let's go ahead and drop that in. We're going to look at these functions in a little more detail later in this section, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now. But what this function is doing is it's getting the node, it's selecting the node ID from FB feed block enabled table, and it's going to fetch that and return the results. So that is just going to see if there's actually a value in the table that's been inserted via our functions up here, our hook node loads. Then the next code we're going to add is we're going to add an entry. So first we're going to see if it's set. Then we're going to add the actual value. So let's go back here to our module and we'll drop that in right at the bottom here under that other database wrapper function. So now we're going to add an entry for a node's Facebook feed block setting. So here the function is set node enabled. We're going to, if there is a numeric node ID, and if that node is set to store, that checkbox is checked, and we're going to go ahead and store that as an enabled node, then we want to do a database insert at that point and then execute it. So those are the first 2 database query functions that we're going to write here. I'm going to leave the last for the next video, but you can go ahead and save your module file. And again, at this point, not much is going to happen on your site. If you try to load your site, it should load at this point. You should have taken care of the errors because you're actually loading the database wrapper functions now, but it's still not going to totally work. It will in the next video. So when we come back, we'll go ahead and add the last database query to our module file. In the last video, we started adding our database queries. So what these are going to do, they're going to actually do stuff to our database. Remember we have a table in here for our FB feed block enabled function that we're running, and this table is going to store node IDs. So we need to actually get data to get stored into that database table. So to do that, we're going to run some queries. The first query we're going to run is, if there's a value stored in there, let's go ahead and get it. So let's select the node ID from the table. And the next query is if you need to set the node ID into the table. In other words, if there is a node ID that you're going to store in there, and if that node has this checkbox checked, so in other words, somebody's checked the box on the node edit form in our site to store it in that table, then let's go ahead and do a database insert. So up here in this first function, we have a database query as the result. So we're querying the database. And in this function, we're doing a database insert. And what's really nice about Drupal and its queries of the database is we store these queries in functions. And that's helpful because, what happens here is these functions become reusable. Whether we're allowing other modules to hook into ours, we have a function defined for that, or whether we just want to write another module that does something similar, we already have the database query written. We don't have to write it again. It's stored nicely packed in a function, and you can just rename it based on the module that you want to run this in and change perhaps the table name. So it's very nice. It stores these inside of these functions. So there's one last one we need to add, and then we should be all set with our latest tweaks to our module. So let's go ahead and copy this one, and we're going to drop this down here. This is the last database query function, and what this is doing, it's removing an entry. So if there's a node ID set for a node, and in other words, if somebody has unchecked the FB feed block enabled box, then what we're going to do is we're going to execute delete, and it's just going to delete the value, and also delete the value entirely if the node itself is deleted. So if there's a node ID and there's a condition where the node ID gets deleted, then we're also going to delete the values from the database for that node ID. So that's our last function. Let's go ahead and save our module, and we'll come back to our site, and at this point we can flush our cache. And in the next video, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. We'll look at what we did. We'll actually try out storing our values, so it'll be pretty exciting because at this point we'll have a lot of our module working, and we'll now be in a very good place to actually go ahead and start building the block, which is the penultimate part of the module, our block to show our actual nodes. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and start doing that. We've done a lot in this section. We wrote a lot of code. What we did to start off in the section was write our hook nodes. So hook node load, and then we wrote a hook node insert, hook node update, and a hook node delete. And then we came down here and did a database query. So first we're just checking to see if there's values in our database, then we're actually setting values in there, and then we're deleting them. What this ultimately will do for us is allow us to use our hook form alter that we wrote earlier. You'll recall that if you went to edit a node, so let's go ahead and do that, and we went to our FB feed block, if we actually checked this box to allow this node to be posted to the FB block, what happened? When we came back and loaded the node again in the edit form, this value was not saved, and we just ended up with a blank box. And sure enough, if we went to check our database table, we browsed for data and there was no data inside of that table where it's supposed to be stored. So what all this code is going to allow us to do is actually store that data. So it took quite a lot of code to get there, but we're now there, and we can go ahead and check our box to test this and save. So I'm saving this value now to this node. Let's go over and actually just refresh our FB feed block enabled table, and we'll do a browse. And notice that I actually now have a value stored in my table, the node NID that has FB feed block enabled. So it's beautiful. It's actually storing the node ID, and that node ID is the node that we edited. So here's node 9, and in the PHP MyAdmin, you'll see that node 9 is defined in there. So this is working, and if I go ahead and edit my node, scroll down and go to the field settings, uncheck that box and save my FB feed block, what do you think will happen if I refresh over here? At this point, that delete function, database wrapper function, is going to take place. And if I try to look in there, notice that I have no data inside there. So the value did get deleted. So this is now working. I can edit a node, scroll down, check my box, and actually save my data to the database. And when I come back over here, refresh it, go into FB feed block enabled, and, well, we have to do browse. There's the data there for node 9. So it's storing that data. So we've done a lot of work to get to this point where we're actually storing the value of our hook form alter, and now that's working. I just want to mention a couple other things about these database queries before we end the section. One thing you should know is that every time you write these database queries, Drupal's doing a lot of sanitization or sanitizing the data as it's coming through on the MySQL query. And it's doing that by things like wrapping the actual table inside of brackets. That's one of the best practices there, and that's how Drupal sanitizes data in a table. And then also, not only are the table names wrapped, we also use placeholders. And so when we write queries, we're writing queries using these placeholders. And they're identified with these identifiers. So here's the NID is the node ID identifier. And we're assigning those identifiers values. So what we're saying is the node ID is always going to be the node ID variable coming out of Drupal. So this is protection here so that people can't just come in and actually put any value they want into your database for sure. So if you're actually setting, you have to make sure you do that on a DB insert, but also with the DB query itself here. And then finally, to obtain results from our database, that's our select query, we're going to append the fetch field to the end. That's another Drupal practice there. So that's a little bit about the Drupal database abstraction layer, as it's called, and just kind of how this result database query is written. And the reason why you have things like the table name in brackets, the semicolon NID, and then the fetch field. In the next section, we're going to actually start working on our block, coding up the block to display our Facebook feed enabled nodes. In section 7, we're going to start talking about Drupal blocks, and we're going to go ahead and create the block that's going to contain our Facebook feed links to the actual Facebook posts and the nodes on the site that we've imported. So just a little background on how blocks work. If you go up to Structure and then click on Blocks, you'll see that Drupal ships with some core blocks that are enabled by default. And then if you scroll down on the block administration page, you'll see that there's a bunch of disabled blocks that also come with the core Drupal. And you can go ahead and enable these in a specific region of the site. Regions are theme specific in Drupal. So you'll recall that currently we have the Bartik theme and the 7 theme enabled on our site. Bartik is the one we're using as our core theme, and 7 as our administrative theme. Each of these themes contains blocks in different ways. Each theme has specific regions. So right now I'm showing the regions for the Bartik theme, and you'll notice that there's a bunch of different regions that you can place these blocks in. So the search form is showing currently in the first sidebar. Navigation is in sidebar first, and the user login is in sidebar first. And if we go to the home page of the site, you'll see that indeed the navigation block here is set in the first sidebar. However, if you go to the 7 tab, you'll see that there are different regions in the 7 administrative theme. It's a good thing to just be aware of. If you change themes, your blocks won't necessarily translate automatically in the new theme. You'll actually have to go in and reset the regions to make sure that your blocks show. So just bear that in mind. What we want to do is we want to create a block on our site, which is going to show the Facebook feed posts that we've imported into our site. And we're going to create this block via our module file that we've written. The first thing we need to do is we have to make Drupal aware of our block. So we have to say, hey Drupal, we've got this block and we want to show this block in a specific region in the theme. So to do that, we're going to write a short bit of code. I have the code over here. It's a block info hook. So function, the name of your module. So the name of our module is FB feed block underscore block underscore info. So this is the hook for the block info function. So we're going to copy this code and we're going to come over to our module file. At the bottom of our module file, we're going to go ahead and drop this hook in. And as you see, this hook defines the block info that shows the block on the main Drupal blocks administrative screen. It's pretty basic code. It opens with the function name. And what it's doing is it's saying, let's make an array for our block variable and let's throw some info at Drupal. And the info we want to tell Drupal is that we have a title right now for our block called Facebook Post. That's the title that's going to show on the administrative page. We're also telling Drupal not to cache the block. You can cache block content in Drupal via the Drupal performance configuration. By default, we're going to say no cache. In other words, we don't want Drupal to cache the content. This makes a lot of sense actually for our Facebook feed post because we want the block to show any Facebook feed post that has been imported without having to cache that content so that the site visitors will see fresh content every time they visit. And then we're just going to go ahead and close that array and then return the actual block itself to Drupal. So let's save this module file, go back to our site, and at this point let's flush our cache. And once we flush the cache, if we go back to the blocks page, you'll actually now see that our Facebook posts block has been created here. There's no content in this block yet, but the info hook that we wrote will tell Drupal that there is indeed a block called Facebook Posts, and we can actually show it in a region. And if we click the configure link, it actually goes to a configuration screen for our block. Drupal provides this base configuration screen. We didn't actually have to write any of this. This all just comes from the core Drupal block module. So by just putting in that simple hook block info, we were able to generate all of this administrative screen information for our block. Additionally, if we go over to our table in the database for block, and we look at the last page in this database table, you'll notice that there are 2 entries for the FB feed block, 70 and 71. They get a block ID, which is a unique identifier. And there's 2 because, remember, we have 1 version for the Bartik theme and 1 version for the 7 theme. So you'll notice that also by declaring the info about the block, it's added 2 rows about the block to our block table in the Drupal database. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and start writing the view for our block, which is going to show the actual content that we want to show to our site visitors, the Facebook feed posts. In the last video, we introduced the concept of blocks. We looked at some core Drupal blocks and how they work, specifically how they work with different themes when you have different themes enabled on your site. And then we wrote a simple function which basically declared our block to the Drupal blocks administrator. So if you go into the blocks admin screen now, you see a block for Facebook posts. And we can actually, take this block and put it into a sidebar and save our blocks admin screen, and notice that we now have a Facebook post block in our first sidebar. However, if we go to the home page, notice nothing actually shows up yet. All we've done is write the block info hook, and all that does is declare the block. It doesn't actually put content into the block. To put content into the block, we need to write a couple more functions. Generally, for rendering the content of a block, you use a function called hook block view. So here's the Drupal API page for that hook. And the way this works, and there's an example here, is that you basically define a delta for the block, which is a variable, and in the case of that specific variable, you stick some content to show into that block. So that's what we're going to do. This is one type of example that you could use that's defined here at the API. The example we're going to use is actually going to define another function that we're then going to write to show the content within this hook block view. So let's go over to our code, and I have some hook block view code here that we can use. So let's copy this function and let's drop that into our module file directly underneath the hook block info. And so let's look at this. So this function, the name of our module, underscore block view, and we're going to define a delta. We're going to switch on that delta, and we're going to make a case statement. So what we're doing here is we're setting the variable to be posts, and we're saying, in the case of this variable, we want to define another variable for the block subject, and that's going to be Facebook feed block posts. Notice that we're wrapping our string in the T function so that this particular subject line can be translatable later if you have translation modules installed. Additionally, we're defining some content. So this is really where the kind of meat of this hook block view happens. We're going to define content to show. But what we're going to do is we're going to reference another function here that's related to the delta that we're calling. And the function that we're going to call is, again, the name of our module, fbFeedBlock_block contents. So it's nice to do it this way because you can keep your functions separate in terms of exactly the functionality that they have and that they're doing on the site. So all our hook block view is doing is it's just defining the function we're going to use to show content inside of the block. We could have, of course, written all of that out within the hook block view function, but it's nice to kind of keep that code separate, and it simplifies things, and also it helps when you're trying to debug something because you can figure out if the issue's happening when the break happens at the end of this hook block view, or if the issue's happening with the actual specific block contents function that we're going to write. So we're just going to return the block at that point and then write a break. So this is our hook block view function. So we can go ahead and save this now and come back to our site and do a flush cache. And at this point, you're actually going to get an error. You will get a white screen, and that's because you recall from before when we reference another function and the function hasn't actually been added to our module file yet, you basically can crash your site. This is very good to know because obviously you would never want to implement a half-written module on a production site. So you would definitely only want to do this in a development environment. It is good to see the effect of doing this, where you add a hook block view, it's calling another function. Drupal doesn't know that that function exists and it's not there yet. So basically we just consume all the memory on the site because it's trying to find a function that's non-existent. So again, just a good thing to know is whenever you have a module installed on a production site, you want to make sure that it does have all the functions that it's defining. But we do have a good step in the right direction here. We definitely want to have the hook block view written so that we can then move on to writing our function. So what we can do right now is not worry about that white screen. We're going to fix it in the next video. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and write the block contents function that this block view function is calling. In the last video, we went ahead and wrote a hook block view function defining our delta variable, and in the case of that variable, in this case posts, we want to show a block subject and some block content. Now the block content isn't actually defined yet. What we're doing is we're making a call to another function called fbFeedBlock contents, and then we're relating that to our switch delta here. So since we don't have that function written, you'll notice that you have a white screen here and all your memory's been used up on the site. So we're going to fix that now. Here in the code file I have a function. This is a custom function that I've written. I'm going to copy this and drop it over here in our module file right underneath our hook block view. So let's copy that and come down here. And under that hook block view, you can paste in the custom function. So this is the custom function called by hook block view to display our block content. So let's define it as function fbFeedBlock contents. Again, it's related to the delta. We're doing a switch on the delta. Again, this is all the same as the previous function. In the case of posts, this time we're going to do a database query. So what we want to do here is we want to query the database and find all the instances of our Facebook feed posts and then show them inside of a block. So the easiest way to do this is if you look inside of the database, you can see in the node table that we have some nodes that have been defined by the feed item content type. So when we imported these Facebook feed posts, we used the feeds module. And the feeds module imports these as nodes into a content type called feed item. So in the database table, these get node IDs, they get type associated with them, they get a title for the node and timestamps for when they were created. This is all very helpful information. In our database query, we can just go ahead and grab this information from the database to show those nodes inside of our block. Now, some of you who have used the views module basically know how to do this very easily using views. And so views is basically a huge database query module. It just allows you to write database queries without having to write the code. In this case, we're going to go ahead and write the code for the query itself. And it'll give you a lot of practice in writing database queries in case you ever come upon a particular use case or requirement where views just isn't going to be sufficient. Of course, you could do this using the views module, but it's nice to be able to do it with a custom module as well. So what we're doing in this function is we're saying if the user has access permissions to view content, that's what that if statement says, then we want to do a result. And our result's going to be equal to a database query. The database query, we're going to write a select statement. We're going to select the NID, which is the node ID, the title, and the type from the node table. That's exactly what we just looked at. So the node table, we're going to select NID, type, and title. And we're going to do this where we're going to put a where statement in there where the type is equal to feed item. So basically, we just want to call in the feed item types and not the other types. And this is filtering just like you would do with the views module. And so the filtering in the views module is basically using this DB query structure. And then we're going to put all this into an array of items. And for each of these, we're going to make a row. And we're going to basically make a row for each link. And then we're going to theme it to look like a list. So the actual rows of the node titles are going to be links. We're wrapping it in the L function here to define those links. The row is going to show the title. It's going to link to the node /, so it's going to link to the path to the node. And so when somebody sees the Facebook post in the block, they'll click on it, and it will then open up that node for that Facebook post. And then we're going to go ahead and return the themed array, and it's just going to be a simple item list to show all the items. And we're going to just use a simple theme function there so that Drupal will just put it into a nice unordered list inside of that block. And then we're going to show our break. So let's go ahead and save this. And at this point, we can come back to our site, and hopefully when we refresh, we get our site back. And certainly we do. There's now no white screen. And notice we actually have our block, Facebook feed block posts. You'll see, remember that we enabled the block before in the first sidebar. And now that we've defined the content, it's bringing in the 3 feed item nodes, the Facebook posts. And the subject is here. That's actually the header of the block, Facebook feed block posts that we defined in the function. And then it's calling in those 3 nodes from our database query, and then it's theming them by just making a simple linked bulleted list. So that's how you do a database query to add content into a block using a custom module on your Drupal site. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and start theming this block. We're going to write a theme template, and then we're going to conclude this section by adding some CSS to style our block. In the last video, we went ahead and wrote a custom function as part of our hook block view. And this custom function queries our database, specifically the node table, searches for any node that's been created using the feed item content type, and then shows those nodes inside of this block. And so you recall that our function for that did a database query. So that's where our query comes into play. And then basically themed our function to display a list of items using the core Bartik theme. Now, what will happen is you'll probably develop a custom theme for your site, and you'll want to add some style and theming to this specific block. So what we're going to do is talk about that in this video. What I've done is I've added a custom theme based on the Omega theme to my themes directory in Sites All Themes. It's beyond this course to go into all the intricacies of theming, but what I've done is I've installed Omega, and I built a custom theme using the Omega starter kit. And so if I go ahead and enable and set the Firehouse theme as the default and go back to the home page, you'll notice that I now have my Facebook feed showing in the first sidebar of the Omega-based custom theme. And that's because if you look at the blocks configuration for the Omega regions, they actually have the same defined regions as Bartik, so they use a sidebar first. And since we had already enabled Facebook posts in that sidebar, they will show up as well in our custom theme. Now the theming looks a little bit different because this is using the core Omega theme styling right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some styling to this block. Now, a good way to do this is you want to first add a template file to your theme specifically for the block content itself. You can actually override right down to the block level in the theme layer. So to find out what you should call that theme template file, you can use this cheat sheet over on the Drupal.org site. This is a Drupal 7 template suggestions. And here, there's some template suggestions for blocks. There's a naming convention with theming in Drupal 7, and that's to add 2 dashes after block before the actual name of the template. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a block-module.tpl. So I've added this TPL file to my templates folder within my custom theme, and the template file is called block-fb-feed-block.tpl. So it's block the name of your module.tpl for template.php. And if we look at the code inside of that template file, notice I've written some custom HTML. You open the template file with PHP, and that's because it's a PHP file. There's nothing inside of the PHP opening and closing brackets, but we are defining some HTML here. The HTML is just a simple div ID. So what I'm doing is I'm overriding the theme by adding a new div, and the div's going to wrap all the content that's printing in the block. So basically all I'm doing with this template file is I'm adding a div ID and I'm adding an H2 header to the block to override the actual block subject line. So we're going to have a Facebook feed header, and then we're going to be printing the content. But because I'm wrapping it with a div, I can come back and style this later. If I save this and then make sure to go to my site and clear my theme registry, then voila, I now have, this is now being overridden, my block, with my template file. And I can confirm that by inspecting this element in Chrome here or in Firefox with Firebug. Notice that I know it's being overridden because here's my div ID for FB feed that's wrapping the content of the actual block. So by seeing that div in there, I know that my template file has taken effect. In the next and last video of the section, we're going to go ahead and apply some CSS styling to the block based on the div we've added via our custom template file at the theme layer. In the last video of this section, we're going to go ahead and add some CSS to style our custom block that we've shown via our module, and also that we've already added a template override file for at the theme layer. So you'll recall that we wanted to add a div, some HTML div code to surround this block so that we can apply some custom style. And so we did a little bit of theming, actually. We went into our custom theme folder and we crafted a template file using the correct suggested template naming convention, which is in Drupal 7, instead of 1 dash, there's 2 dashes that separate the beginning of the template file name from the actual module that you're theming. So in this case, block dash dash the name of the module, tpl.php. And inside of there, there's some HTML that just adds a div ID. So we've customized the div ID. And so now that we've done that, we can actually come in here, inspect our element for our block, and see that the div's actually printing out in our source code. So that's good. That shows that our template is overriding that block. So now what we can do is we can go into our CSS folder in our custom theme and grab a CSS file. It doesn't really matter which one. That'll be dependent on your custom theme and how you structure your style sheets. In the case of Omega, they have a global CSS inside of the custom. So I'm going to go ahead and use global CSS. It already has some style in there. I'm just going to go ahead and take some code that I've written for this block, CSS code, and I'm going to come over here and drop the code in. Let's just look at this quickly. We've defined 3 custom styles for our block. We've defined an overall style to affect the padding, font, background color, and border of our actual div, which is the FB feed. That refers to the div defined here in our template. And then we've added a style for the link and a style for the header. Let's go ahead and save that and come back over and refresh our site. And now you have a block that's really starting to look good.
We've added a background color to the block. We really made the header bold. We did white text on that darker background color. And we took text decoration off of the links in the supplied list. If you inspect this element now, you'll notice that we have our div ID for FB feed, and then over here in Chrome in the inspector, you can see that our custom CSS is now printing out here. And if you go deeper in, like the H2, you can see our custom CSS there and into the actual link itself, and we have the FB feed A, white color and no text decoration. So in a matter of less than 5 minutes, we went ahead and applied quite a bit of style to make this block look really nice inside of our custom theme. So to conclude this section on not only displaying the custom block itself, but also the template files in the theming layer, we've done quite a bit. We not only show the block, do a database query to filter in links to the block, links to content, but we've also styled the block, applied a custom div with some HTML, and also some custom style using CSS. In the final section of the course, we're going to talk about security, performance, and how to test our module to make sure that everything looks good, all the code work, and we're getting good performance and security and stability from our module. In this last section of the video course, we're going to talk about Drupal security and performance in terms of how our module is working in our website and trying to keep the module secure, well-coded, according to Drupal coding best practices, and also performing well. We've done a lot throughout the course. Let's just review what we've done with this module. We went ahead and created a configuration screen for our module so that we can choose which content types to allow our module to work with. We've also configured how many Facebook feed items to show here. On the actual Facebook feed nodes themselves, we went in and added a FB feed block configuration box with a checkbox that allows us to add per node settings to our nodes on our site across all content types and allow them to be selected to be posted into the block. And then finally, we added a Facebook feed block via our module file. So we've written quite a lot of code. One of the things you're going to want to do as you write module code is make sure that you're coding per Drupal coding best practices, and also that you're keeping your code secure. We've done this by using some functions already, like the T function. According to Drupal best practice, you want to make sure you wrap strings of text that you're going to want to translate via translation modules. To do this securely and set it up according to Drupal best practice coding standards, we want to wrap these strings in T functions. So we've already went ahead and done some of this security and preparation up front. You can learn more about the T function over on the Drupal API, and here's the T function page. And the nice thing about the API is it explains in lots of detail what the T function is used for, the purpose of it, and then it gives a lot of examples. I also want to point out down here, the middle of this page on the T function, there's a link to sanitization functions. And you're going to run into this more when you start to code up more modules. You're going to want to make sure that you're sanitizing your data that you're bringing in and out of your module. And to do this, you want to make sure that you're writing secure code. So it's really important to read through all of this documentation, the sanitization functions part of the Drupal API. This link here goes to a writing secure code document. And again, you want to make sure that you read through this. And again, this is something that we've done with our DB queries. You'll recall over here in our module file, if you look for one of the database queries, that we're making sure we're putting tables inside of these brackets, that we're using placeholders. And in this document here, it explains a lot more about that. So here's your placeholders wrapping your database table names inside curly brackets and that sort of thing. So it's really important to make sure you read this writing secure code document, and also just get up to speed on the different sanitization functions like check markup, check plain, check URL, etc. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and actually install a module that allows us to do a code review of our module code. In the last video, we started talking about the security of our site and the modules that we're writing. There are some helper modules that you can install, which will not only review the security of your entire Drupal site and the modules within it, but also do code reviews of all of the core and contributed modules that you have installed and any custom modules that you've written. Let's just point out these modules, and then we'll actually try using one of them. The security review module, I'm looking at its project page here at Drupal.org. This module will review the security of your entire Drupal site. There is a stable version for Drupal 7. And if you look at the screenshot here, it'll show you the kind of reporting mechanism that it gives you. And it'll tell you things like whether your input filter tags are set correctly, or that if you're allowing tags into nodes like PHP, which would be considered dangerous, whether the private files and different file extensions have been enabled or disabled, and whether your user permissions and roles are set up correctly. So the security review module is an essential module to add to your site's module repertoire when you're doing development and testing out your site. Another module that's really good is the coder module, and its project page is here. And what the coder module does is it actually does a full code review, and it includes a submodule called coder review, and it reviews all your source code files for both core contributed modules and also any modules that you've written custom. And additionally, this module also has a coder upgrade, which allows you to review Drupal 6 modules and see if you can upgrade them easily to Drupal 7 versions. So this module is very helpful. There is a stable 7 version. I've gone ahead and downloaded the 7 version of Coder, and I've installed it over here on our site. And so if you do a regular install of the Coder module and then look for it under the development section of your modules administration page, you'll see I've enabled Coder Review. I haven't enabled Coder Upgrade here because we're not actually doing an upgrade, and it also requires another library, gplib. But for now, we'll just use Coder and Coder Review. I went ahead and saved my modules page. And now if I go to my configuration development, Coder, this is the Coder configuration screen. You can do a lot with this. What I've done is checked that I want to do a review of Drupal coding standards, commenting standards, security checks, and internationalization and Drupal SQL standards. Also, I want to review specifically include files, since we've written some include files and test files, and core files because we've written module files. And down here under select specific modules, you can actually select any and all of the modules that you want to review. So a lot of them are checked by default, the cores, but then you'll notice that there's a bunch of contributed and custom modules. I'm going to go ahead and select the custom FB feed block. It also tells you whether the module is active. So this is really helpful. And if we scroll down at this point, you can also actually select specific themes to review for security. We'll uncheck the themes right now. And then I can do run reviews. When I click the run reviews button, Coder will actually run a full review of all the code on the site that I've checked within this module selection box here. Now, depending on how many modules you actually have selected and that you want to run the test on, it may take a while for it to run. So what it did was it ran and it found 32 projects, 343 files, and 61 critical warnings and 597 normal warnings. So what we can do is we can scroll down here. Notice that there are some issues with block module. We can go down to our custom module because that's the one that we're really interested in. And notice that our custom FB feedblock module actually has no critical warnings. However, there are a bunch of best practice warnings telling us that we actually have not really followed the use indent of 2 spaces with no tabs best practice protocol. So the great thing about this is it can save you a lot of time. It finds the line of code in the module, and then it tells you what the issue is. So you can just go right to that line, and then you can go ahead and fix the issue. So here are all the warnings for our module. It also looked in the admin.inc file, the install file, and the test file. The nice thing about this is it didn't find any critical warnings, and you'll notice that there are critical warnings in some of the other contributed modules. But again, Coder is an indispensable module. You won't want to live without it, and it can really help you to speed up your coding process, especially in terms of best practice. We've spent the last couple of videos talking in detail about security and performance. Not only can we do reviews of our module code to make sure we're following Drupal coding best practices and that we're fixing security issues, but we can also run tests of our module. Tests are automated. In other words, a lot of the testing we've done so far is manual. We've clicked around our module, going to configuration page, we've checked boxes and clicked the Save Configuration button. Everything we've done is manual testing. And the problem with manual testing is there are times when you can miss a specific part or process of that test and not be able to reproduce an error that might be lying there. So what testing does, when you automate testing, it allows you to really test out your module from an automatic perspective and make sure you're covering all bases in terms of running sufficient and accurate tests. In Drupal 6, there was a module called Simple Test, and Simple Test allowed you to do automated testing. The Simple Test module also does have a 7 version and a really good documentation section for introducing you to how to use the Simple Test module. Now, the one thing about Drupal 7 is that Simple Test actually comes as part of Drupal 7 core now. So on our site, if you just go to the modules section, we don't actually need to install Simple Test. You can go down to your core modules and you'll notice that there is a module called Testing, provides a framework for unit and functional testing. And I can check the box there. Also notice here that in the brackets there's a code review, and this link now shows up because in the previous video, recall we enabled the Coder module. When you enable Coder module, it puts a link for a specific code review just for this module on the modules administration screen. So you can be on a module administration screen and do code reviews directly from this screen. I'm going to check testing and I'm going to save my module configuration. Once I do that, I can come over to the configuration screen and click on the testing link. And this opens up the testing administration screen, which lists in a table all the tests that we can run. And what happens with tests is that each module provides a .test file, and these .test files do specific things. And so you'll see here that Actions has a .test file and runs specific types of tests. Administration menu, aggregator, all of these modules have these tests that you can run. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to come back and we're going to actually write a .test file, add it to our module, and then run the test from this administration screen. In this video, we're going to go ahead and write our .test file. So, as we explained in the previous video, you can install a module called Simple Test, which actually comes as part of Drupal 7 core. It's the testing module. The testing module allows you to run specific automated tests of all your contributed and custom modules on your website. And if you want to run a test, though, your module has to provide a .test file. If you look in module folders of the contributed modules or the core modules, you'll notice that a lot of them have test files. Here's a test file for contextual module, and in the forum module, we have a forum.test file. The easiest process to go through to write a test file is just to grab a test file that's already part of core. So this is the forum.test file. Copy all of the code in this .test file, and then go ahead and create a .test file inside of your custom module folder. So what I've done here is I've created an fb_feed_block.test. The extension is .test. The other thing I did was to get Aptana to recognize the .test files for PHP purposes. In the PHP source, I added the .test extension. It wasn't there by default, so just make sure you add it. If you don't add it, all the text in the .test files will just appear white. But notice if I come over here to my modules.test, you'll notice that it's got the PHP color coding. So what I did was I went ahead and pasted the entire forum.test code into this file. And then I basically stripped out all the extraneous code I did not need. The only thing I left was the public static function, getInfo, the setup function, which is here, and the test function. So there's only 3 functions in my .test file. There's a class definition with a public static function, getInfo. There's a setup function, and there's a test FB feedblock settings function. So this is my .test file. The other thing I did was I came in here and rename something. I renamed my test case to be FB feedblock test case instead of the forum test case. And I did a name of my actual test, which is FB feedblock functionality, a description of it. Then down here, I actually want to do a function setup of my FB feedblock module. So just you put in your module name there. And then I'm going to actually make sure that the permissions for the user that I'm testing is in here. But what we should do first is just review what our test process is going to do. What we want to do to test is we want to actually test to see if we have an unchecked box here for basic page, right? What we want to test is to make sure that on any time we add content for basic page that we don't have the FB feedblock box here. However, if this is checked, then what we want to do is make sure that when we add content with a basic page that we do have the FB feedblock configuration option set on the node. So what this testing allows us to do is just test those different scenarios. So what I've done here is I've made sure that my setup is going to define the administrative user and the permissions that they're going to need to run the test, which is managed Facebook feedblock settings. I grabbed this permission from my .module file up here in my original hook permission. I just grabbed the same managed Facebook feedblock settings permission and dropped it in here. I also added a create page content because we want to allow the user to create a basic page. And then down here, I'm actually running the test. It's saying this user's logged in. Let's go ahead and get the node add page. Let's go ahead and assert some text which says, if allow this node to be posted to the FB block. If that text is not present, then the FB feedblock settings were not found. Then you can change the settings to enable the FB feedblock on pages and edit an array, set an array for that, and then do a Drupal post and save configuration, and then check to appear that the FB feedblock settings do appear when you add the page. So this is the process we went through. We said if the box is unchecked, then make sure that it's not appearing. If the box is checked, make sure it's appearing. So that's our test. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and run our test via the testing module. So up to this point, what we've done is we've enabled the testing module, and then we've created a .test file inside of our custom module folder. And our .test file is running a test for testing the configuration options of our module. So what this test is going to do is it's going to go through the entire login process for an administrative user, and then it's going to run through the actual test that we've been doing manually, which is to go first to the FB feedblock settings, making sure this is unchecked, then going to add content, basic page, and making sure that there is indeed no box here. So this is the test that it's going to run. So to actually initiate the test, we're going to go to configuration and down to testing under the development section. And we're going to expand the testing, and we're going to go down to find our, now remember our test is actually stored in the other section right here in the group other. This here, this public static function getInfo, this is what's determining where it shows up in our table here. So we have to look for other, expand that, and here's our FB feedblock functionality test. So we can check this box, and again, this is defined completely by this .test file. And then we can go and say run tests, and it's going to go ahead and process the test. And it'll take a few seconds dependent on the performance of your local host server. And what it's going to do is it's going to generate a pretty detailed report of the entire test process. And what's really cool is that not only will we get a report of the actual process, so here's the report, 19 passes, 0 fails, 1 exception, and 6 debug messages. So it's nice. Nothing failed. We had 19 total passes, and we have some debug messages. So let's look at this. What it's done is it's done a whole process. It's actually enabled the module, created a role, created permissions, created a user. Down here, it determined that that user has an account. Then down here, it went and did a node add page. It didn't see the block settings. So this is doing the actual test. Now, what you can do here is you can actually, if you click on the verbose message link, this is going to pop up the actual specific stage of the test itself. And this is pretty amazing. So this is where the test actually logged into the site. This was the test of the actual login process with this kind of fake user account it used for the test. This was the going to the create basic page, and notice that there's an undefined index shown, and that's because there is no hook form alter taking place on this node during the test. And again, here is the test to show that since there was no box showing up here on the basic page for the FB feed block settings, then indeed it must not have been checked here. So it tested that. Then it went and tested and said, hey, if it's checked, what's the next part of the test going to result in? And that resulted indeed in a FB feed block box here. So you can see this went through the entire test process. That was it. So it's pretty powerful. You can actually run that full automated test just by clicking your mouse through, reproduce the test just by clicking your mouse through those results and get a really nice printout of the results in that report that the test file and the testing module generate for you. So that's a quick look at how to use the testing module and how to write a .test file to test both the functionality, security, and performance of your custom module.